I think we'll start now. We have a quorum, so I guess we'll get started. Let me turn on my camera here. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Tom Armitage. I'm from the EPA Science Advisory Board office. I'm the designated federal officer for the EPA Science Advisory Board. And I would like to reconvene this meeting of the Chartered Science Advisory Board. This is a continuation of the meeting that we began yesterday, November 3rd. And before I turn the meeting over to the chair of the SAB, Dr. Allison Cullen, I'm going to take the role of SAB members and board liaisons. So please let me know that you're on this call when I call your name. Dr. Allison Cullen.
Present.
Dr. Marjorie Elion.
Present.
Dr. David Allen. Dr. Susan Annenberg.
Present.
Dr. Florence Anuro. Dr. Joe Arvai. Dr. Barbara Beck.
Present. I just want to say I'll probably have to hop off at 3:30.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. Dr. Roland Benke.
Present.
Dr. Tammy Bond.
Present.
Dr. Mark Borsak. Dr. Sylvie Bruder.
Present.
Dr. Jay Chakraborty.
Present.
Dr. Amin Chen.
Present.
Dr. Amy Childress.
Present.
Dr. Wei Sui Chu.
Present.
Dr. Ryan Emanuel.
Present. I also want to note that I'll have to duck out briefly at 1 p.m., but I'll be back.
Thank you. Mr. Earl Fordham.
Present.
Dr. John Guggenheimer.
Present.
Dr. Steve Hamburg. Dr. Marcus Hendricks. Dr. Celine Hernandez Ruiz.
Present.
Dr. Alina Irwin.
Present.
Dr. David Kaiser.
Present.
Dr. Mark Le Chevalier.
Present.
Dr. Angela Lung.
I'm present, and I'm just going to have to leave briefly at 3:15 Eastern, but I'll be back as well.
Thank you. Miss Lisa Lonefight.
Present.
Dr. Lala Ma. Dr. John Morris.
Present.
Dr. Enid Neptune. Dr. Sheila Olmstead.
Present.
Dr. Austin Omer.
Present.
Dr. Gloria Post.
Present.
Dr. Christy Pullen-Fednick.
Present.
Dr. Amanda Rodewald.
Present.
Dr. Emma Rosie.
Present.
Dr. John Samet.
Present.
Dr. Leanne Shepard.
Present.
Dr. Drew Schindel.
Present.
Dr. Janae Smith. Dr. Richard Smith. Dr. Daniel Stram.
Present.
Dr. Peter Thorne. Dr. Godfrey Uzachekwu.
Present.
Dr. Wei-Sung Wang.
Present.
Dr. June Weintraub.
Present.
Dr. Scobie Wilson. Dr. Dominic van der Mensbrug.
Present.
And the board liaisons, Dr. Daniel Schlenk. Dr. Robert Chapin. Dr. Paul Gilman. Dr. Dina Scher. Okay, great. With that, I'm going to now turn the meeting over to Dr. Cullen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. And good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for those in the West. I'd like to welcome you to the second day of the meeting of the EPA Science Advisory Board. We met yesterday as well. And we have two items on the agenda for today. First, we're going to be discussing the scientific and technical basis of EPA's proposed rule, control of air pollution from new motor vehicles, heavy-duty engine and vehicle standards. And following the discussion of the proposed heavy-duty engine and vehicle standards rule, we'll discuss recommendations received from the SAB work group for the review of science supporting EPA decisions. These recommendations address the SAB review of planned EPA regulatory actions. And I also want to note, we heard public comments yesterday, and there's also a public comment period today toward the end of the meeting to hear brief clarifying comments. The purpose of this short second period is really brief comments from members of the public concerning points that are raised at the meeting, and these are approximately 2-minute comments. So for those who would like to provide clarifying comments, please send an email to our designated federal officer, Tom Armitage, before the scheduled break. You can find his email address on the SAB meeting website. Are there any questions from SAB members before we begin? I don't see any. All right, so we'll begin with the SAB discussion of the scientific and technical basis of EPA's proposed heavy-duty engine and vehicle standards rule. We're reviewing the science supporting this rule as part of our statutory duties. SAB is required by law to receive information from EPA about the science supporting any planned action when that is also provided to any other federal agency for formal review and comment. And the board may then decide to review the adequacy of the scientific and technical basis of planned actions as warranted. At the SAB meeting that we held on May 31st and June 2nd, the board decided it would review the science supporting EPA's proposed heavy-duty engine and vehicle standards rule. And at that meeting, we discussed providing advice on several topics, which included environmental justice issues, the multi-pollutant analysis, the benefit cost analysis, and a number of air quality issues, such as spatial resolution of air quality modeling, and benefits of NO2 reduction. So after that board meeting, May 31st and June 2nd, the SAB staff office formed a work group. It's chaired by Dr. Susan Annenberg to go ahead with review of the proposed rule. That work group developed charge questions related to the topics that had been raised of interest that were discussed by the board, as well as additional topics that were raised by work group members. I asked Dr. Annenberg and the work group members to develop a draft report to be discussed by the full board at a meeting of the chartered SAB, which is today. The work group's draft report and the proposed rule have been posted on the SAB website. I would now like us to discuss the report and reach agreement on any changes or additions that are needed before it is transmitted to the EPA as a final SAB report. So it's in draft right now. And I would like to note that we can include findings and recommendations beyond the scope of the charge questions in the report. So members can be thinking about that if they would like to raise anything additional. To begin the discussion, I will ask Dr. Annenberg to provide a brief summary of the scope of the work group report. This will include the topics and the charge questions addressed, and then I would ask that we discuss the responses to each charge question. There are lead discussants listed on the meeting agenda to initiate that discussion, and they'll provide a brief summary of the charge question response that we see in the draft report, and then we'll have comments from all SAB members. After discussing the responses to each of the charge questions, we'll then briefly discuss the key points that are included in the appendix and in the preamble of the draft. Again, in our discussions, I would like to reach agreement on any changes that are needed. If we agree upon a report change, I would ask members to send the revised text to the DFOs, Tom Armitage and Shanta Hill-Hammond, after the meeting, or we may agree that I will work with the DFOs to incorporate the change after the meeting, but we do reach consensus on these changes. So now I'd like to ask Dr. Annenberg to provide a brief summary of the scope of the heavy duty rule work group report.
Thank you, Dr. Cullen. Is it possible to get screen sharing privileges? I just have some slides to
I think Will King will know the answer to that question. Can we have screen sharing? There you go. You should work now. You're a co-host.
Thank you. Okay, I just put together some slides to help us walk through this, but thank you so much to everyone who participated in the work group here. It was a pleasure to chair the work group. I think it's such an important rule, proposed rule, and you'll see that in our draft report that we start off by congratulating EPA on tackling a major source of not just health damaging air pollution, but air pollution inequity. that continues to affect communities of color and communities with lower income and lower educational attainment levels. We felt that this is one of the priority areas that EPA could address those environmental inequities, especially air pollution inequities. And you'll see that a lot of the charge questions reflect that theme, that environmental justice, that the impacts of this rule on environmental justice are so large, so potentially impactful, that we wanted to ensure that the methods used for estimating the environmental justice impacts are adequate. They also reflect the comments that were raised on the earlier SAB meeting that Dr. Cullen mentioned. So it's not just focused on environmental justice, but also some of the other things that were raised by SAB members during that call. So we also discussed on that previous SAB call that the proposed rule was moving forward at a fairly fast pace, and we didn't have, there would not be time for EPA to incorporate some of the longer term methodological developments and improvements that we thought needed to be made. Therefore, we broke out our charge questions into two segments. One is SAB advice and comments on the proposed rule, and the other is for future regulatory actions. So you'll see here the charge questions in the first vein here. So those comments on the proposed rule, things that EPA could benefit from hearing advice on in the near term as they develop the final version of this rule. You'll see some of them relate to each other. So given the spatial resolution of this rule's air quality modeling, which was 12-kilometer, and its inability to reflect the near roadway NO2 gradient, would NO2 assessment be informative for this rule? Would the effect of heavy-duty vehicles on local air pollution be informative for this rule? Are there concerns for equity across different communities? Can benefits be estimated for the reduction of NO2 as they are for PM 2.5 and ozone in this rule for children's asthma or other adverse health effects? What is the cost of healthcare associated with air emissions and pollution overall, and particularly in disadvantaged communities? And then given the known data and methodological limitations, how could the EPA consider the environmental justice impacts of this rule using the available data from the current proposal? Are you seeing my slides advanced? Just making sure.
Yes.
Okay, great. For future regulatory actions, these are items that we felt that are on the longer trajectory of technical development, and therefore would not be possible for the EPA to incorporate into the current rule as it is being finalized on a short time frame. And this addressed how will PM 2.5 ozone and NO2 concentration disparities change if EPA achieves maximum emission reductions? How can EPA consider multiple pollutants, the combined effects of the pollutant mixture simultaneously, including the potential reduction for several pollutants at the same time? And then what technical tools and approaches are necessary for EPA to model population disparities in air quality and health benefits of regulation? So again, taking that longer term view of development of technical approaches so that we can move into a place where EPA has the ability to conduct higher resolution modeling or use other techniques to capture some of these smaller scale disparities that are affecting neighborhoods. Through the process of addressing the charge questions, the committee felt that a lot of our responses to the charge questions were so similar that we actually wanted to elevate a recommendation to EPA develop a strategy for systematic quantitative evaluation of the environmental justice impacts of air pollution regulations. Therefore, we elevated that into a new preamble section that was not part of the original vision for this document. So I wanted to highlight that here. The discussion that follows will be specific to charge questions, but I wanted to elevate that these recommendations exist in a new preamble that goes before the charge questions. And it really cuts across multiple charge questions. You'll see more detail on this recommendation in the charge questions. I also wanted to highlight for the committee that, for the board, that there are specific considerations that we laid out in the preamble for EPA's plan for including distributional analyses in regulatory impact analyses. And I won't read through all these here, but we felt that these were all important considerations. I do wanted to mention the last point here, which is that we recognize that there are data and computational limitations that could hinder the EPA from producing timely analyses for NAAQS reviews and regulations. And we did not want to suggest that EPA slow down their very important analyses. And therefore wanted to make sure that the above considerations were balanced with the additional time and resources needed to conduct this additional level of analysis. Excuse me. Going back to the preamble, there's another section here on climate impacts, which was not part of the original charge questions. This was raised by one of our subcommittee members during the course of our discussions. The EPA's notice of proposed rulemaking indicated that they could not, that they intended to estimate the climate benefits, but could not do so as the application of the social cost of greenhouse gases was sort of tied up in court rulemakings. That, I believe, has since been resolved, and therefore the subcommittee developed a draft recommendation that the agency include the valuation of climate benefits in the final rule, as the agency stated they had intended to do in the notice of proposed rulemaking. Finally, I wanted to note that there is an Appendix A to this, as Dr. Wilson submitted some very thoughtful comments that came after the subcommittee had deliberated together. Therefore, we did not include them in the draft report, as we didn't have time for them to be discussed by the full subcommittee. But they're very important, and we wanted to ensure that they were reviewed by the whole board and that we could incorporate these into the report in final version. So with that, I will stop sharing and we can move on to the first charge question.
Thanks so much, Dr. Annenberg, and really the whole work group for all the effort that went into this, and really appreciate that you separated out your findings and recommendations into sort of the immediate and the longer term, since regulatory processes are always continuous and ongoing. So appreciate the ability of EPA to take up as much of that as they can. Thanks. So we're now going to discuss the work group findings and recommendations for report topic 1, air quality impacts. So this is charge questions 2.1, 2, and 3. For question 2.1, I'll ask Dr. Janae Smith to begin the discussion, summarize the response to the charge question. The question is, given the spatial resolution of this rule's air quality modeling and its inability to reflect the near roadway NO2 gradient, would NO2 assessment be informative for this rule? Go ahead, Dr. Smith.
And I think Dr. Smith was not able to be here today. I'm trying to scan and make sure she's not here. In which case I will take over.
Oh, sorry, I may have, yeah, I'm sorry. I don't think I caught that. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So in response to this charge question, we wanted to offer several recommendations that were at varying levels of complexity. And the first is, so from least complexity to most, or least difficulty to most. At a minimum, we felt that it was important to include a thorough discussion of what is missing by not including nitrogen dioxide, and the implications of using a 12-kilometer grid as opposed to a higher resolution grid that would enable neighborhood scale analysis. So that was the minimum that we thought was necessary. The next recommendation in terms of the level of complexity, the next step would be to consider using other existing sources of data, again, recognizing that we're in the section of the charge questions here that pertain to the EPA's current rulemaking, and therefore there's not a lot of time to add a whole new set of chemical transport modeling, for example. So what other data sets could be brought in here that the agency could consider in its rulemaking that would not be specific to the exact policy scenarios here, but would still be informative? And so some of the suggestions that we had were NOx assessments from the California Air Resources Board, as well as satellite-derived NO2 estimates, and perhaps also PM 2.5 estimates that show neighborhood scale disparities. The more complex option would be to, again, recognizing that we deemed it impossible for the agency to conduct new high resolution modeling for this current regulation. The more complex option here would be to use the current chemical transport modeling that was already completed for the proposed rule and use the NO2 concentrations from that modeling, albeit at the 12-kilometer resolution, which is not adequate to capture those neighborhood scale pollution differences. But at least we would have some kind of estimate of nitrogen dioxide impacts of this rule, recognizing that NO2 is the traffic-related air pollutant that would be most affected by heavy-duty vehicle NOx emission reductions, and is also a marker of the inequitable traffic-related air pollution distributions within urban areas.
All right, so is it time then to hear the comments from the SAB? Any additions, any changes, any suggestions based on what you've seen in the draft report? John Morris, go ahead. You're on mute. John, you're on.
I thought this was very well
there you
written,
go.
and I have a question and just a thought for a little clarity. I get the idea that there's not enough time to really do a detailed analysis. I just wonder if in point number one, we could just explicitly state that due to time limitations, right, they should be described, you know, or we recognize time limitations preclude a thorough analysis at this time, but this should be an ongoing work, because it doesn't explicitly say that there, you know.
Okay.
It's inferred, but it doesn't seem to be explicit. Because it raises the question of really, are there models that are sufficiently developed and validated? I don't know the answer to that question, whether they're validated models. So at least we could give them the out, you know, to explain why it's not present at the current time. The other question I have is because you talk about, you know, new NO2 non-attainment zones. And I don't know the answer to this, obviously. I mean, how widespread is NO2 non-attainment? I know in Connecticut, it doesn't seem to be a problem. The monitoring here has our levels threefold below the standard. So, I mean, is this a widespread problem in the country? And if it's not, then why are we looking at it?
I can respond to that briefly. No, we do not have non-attainment areas for NO2, but our standard is 10 times higher than the World Health Organization guideline for NO2. And there are health effects that occur at levels far below the current NO2 max.
Should we say that? Because there's sort of a disconnect, which we'll get to downstream. I mean, in essence, we're saying the current NO2 standard is too permissive. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
See, that's a disconnect in this whole document. And it raises a whole different issue. So just this is what confused me, you know, and so maybe we could somewhere say that we have concerns because the NO2 standard may be too permissive or something of that nature. Because there just is a disconnect. There's no non-attainment zone in the country, but we're saying we need to model this and you know, do cost health savings. You know, it doesn't make any sense. We can get back to this downstream.
This is a good time to raise it before we turn to the next comment. Are there any other SAB members that want to add their thoughts on the permissiveness or call it what you will of the NO2 standard? Jump in if that's your comment. Otherwise, I've got a queue waiting for other additional things. Sheila, go ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I just would say that we, you know, the agency in its regulatory impact analyses analyzes impacts, you know, even in compliance with the standard all the time, right? For PM and other, right? So I guess I'm torn a little bit. I think it's a great point in terms of mentioning it in the, you know, maybe in the response, right, to this particular question, but I don't see necessarily the disconnect between the fact that, right, compliance is essentially 100% and, right, being concerned about health impacts below the standard.
Okay, and we do defer to KSAC on standards. Go ahead, John. Samet, I see you.
Just a quick comment as a member of the last two WHO air quality guideline groups. I mean, it's a very different process that led to the guideline value. And I just think we have to be careful in putting in our language around proposing the WHO air quality guideline versus the NACs. They're just so different in their derivation. And I just would urge caution.
Yeah, and if we were to weigh in, it would be on the science supporting, and it would not be on the standard itself. Let's see, I think we have, Dr. Morris, did you want to add one more thing, or yes, go ahead.
Do you see my confusion? Because theoretically, the US, US standard is health protective. And if the current standard is health protective and the entire country is in attainment, then this really isn't a health issue. That's my confusion.
I'll let Dr. Annenberg respond, and then we'll turn back to Dr. Samet.
Thank you. Yeah, these are not standards at any sort of low concentration threshold for health effects. So there are health effects that occur below all the standards that we currently have, including for PM 2.5. And those are very important health impacts to consider. We do include that for PM 2.5, for example, and there's very good reason to be doing that.
Dr. Samet, you're up.
Well, just as a comment, I mean, the Clean Air Act is clear about what the NACs are supposed to do, which is to protect health with an adequate margin of safety. I think the dilemma is whether for PM or for other pollutants that the epidemiological data keep pushing the point lower and below the NACs at which adverse health effects can be demonstrated. And the WHO process leads to an epidemiologically based sort of no observed effect level, essentially, with some margin built in. So it's just a different process. And I think we have to, and I think this goes back to Susan's comment earlier, the epidemiological data are perhaps suggesting that this goal of achieving, protecting health with an adequate margin of safety is, for some pollutants now, not possible. That's been demonstrated for quite a while for PM.
Yeah, and for ozone as well. I guess my question is, has it been demonstrated for NO2? Why don't we wait till we get downstream?
All right. John Guckenheimer is waiting, and I know, Jay, you were waiting as well, Dr. Chakraborty. Why don't we go ahead with Dr. Guckenheimer, and then if you want to come back in, Jay, we can do that.
So I just like to, I'm not sure whether this is the right time to raise this issue, but some of the input from outside the board and the EPA that we've gotten really argues that the right solution to these problems is electrification of heavy duty vehicles. And it seems to me that if that is going to take place, it would cut across and the things that we're discussing now and make some of these regulations much less important. And so I'd just like to ask whether that will be part of our discussion and part of the report that we will write, or is the report being written from the standpoint of assuming that gasoline, diesel-powered heavy-duty vehicles are going to be prevalent for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, Dr. Annenberg, do you want to address scope in that sense?
We can review the assumptions that the agency made in terms of electrification in the baseline scenario. Perhaps I think that might get to your point. I don't think that we can make any assumptions about electrification that go beyond what the agency has included in the baseline, unless we deem that the scientific basis for those assumptions are unfounded.
All right, and we also we have in the chat from Dominique, isn't spatial heterogeneity an issue? I think this is related to the NO2 conversation, but correct me if I'm wrong, Dr.
Yes, this is spatial heterogeneity will come up several times in these charge questions, I think you'll find, because NO2 is a pollutant that is shorter lived than PM 2.5, and it has fewer emission sources, whereas PM 2.5 is more of a regional pollutant affected by many sources, both urban and regional. NO2 is much more impacted by urban emissions and especially traffic-related air pollution. Because it only lives in the atmosphere for a shorter period of time, it ends up being much more spatially heterogeneous compared with PM 2.5. And therefore, the 12-kilometer modeling that is typical for PM 2.5 doesn't work as well for a pollutant like NO2 that exhibits much more spatial heterogeneity.
My point relates to the standard, because the standard is irrelevant if you're living in an area that has high concentration.
You bring up another good point that our air quality monitoring system for evaluating attainment is not complete enough to spatially complete enough to capture high pollutant levels that might be occurring away from the monitor. And that's especially important for a pollutant like NO2 for the reasons I just mentioned, that it has much more spatial heterogeneity. So the regional air quality monitoring network may not be sufficient for evaluating a pollutant like NO2, where you might have hotspots away from the monitor.
Dr. Bond.
Hi, thanks. At the risk of making the can of worms even more open than it already is, I think this touches on some of the questions that came up yesterday in discussing environmental justice, that where people kind of came out and said, well, we've got a pretty good understanding of what the baseline is, and we now we're not as good at assessing alternatives. And I think that's also playing in here. What do we do with this information? There's always going to be spatial heterogeneity, especially with NO2, because it does that. And so does the simple fact of spatial heterogeneity mean that we have to do something, or where's the level of action? And then this relates to other comments on what the standard is and whether we're achieving it already. And so I feel like as we get into these questions of justice, which are inherently questions about heterogeneity, but play into much, much larger issues, that we're always going to have this question. And so is there guidance on how to think about, is our goal to just reduce heterogeneity always? Or is it to make sure that everybody is below a certain kind of level?
Dr. Annenberg, did you want to respond to that? I mean, basically the latter, the Clean Air Act.
Right, yeah. Dr. Bond, I think that's an excellent way to pose the question that the committee was struggling with. You know, there will always be some spatial heterogeneity that we're not able to capture based on our computational limitations or ability to estimate emissions at certain scales. And that is why we felt that it was important for the agency to develop a strategy for how to do this in regulatory impact analyses that captures more of that spatial heterogeneity than is currently possible with 12 kilometers, but enables them to do that in a way that doesn't stall them on producing regulatory impact analyses in a timely manner. And so it really, you know, we, at the risk of sounding like we're punting on this, you know, I think we don't know the answer to the question of what spatial heterogeneity is ideal in terms of that balance of captures neighborhood scale heterogeneity, but doesn't overwhelm the computational power needed to produce these assessments. And we wanted to hear from the agency about what they thought was possible given the needs that they have.
Thanks. So just sort of trying to sum up in terms of any changes that the board is suggesting in the response to this charge question. We have a suggestion to explicitly state that time limitations preclude a more complete analysis. It's implied, but just to sort of clarify that. On NO2 non-attainment, you know, I think we have to be careful. We've heard from a few different members. We are always keeping our eye on the science and technical basis underlying any standard or regulation. So I'm not sure we got something there that we wanted as an explicit change, but if someone has specific language they were thinking about, maybe we should hear that now. And then Dr. Annenberg, you look ready to go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we have a charge question later that more addresses that
Yeah,
issue.
so we'll get to that one. I think everything else, great comments. Yeah, I think we're well set up to continue on with the rest of the charge questions. So thanks. So seeing no other hands, I would ask Sheila Olmsted, Dr. Olmsted, please summarize the response to charge question 2.2. And that question is, would the effect of heavy duty vehicles on local air pollution be informative for this rule? Are there concerns for equity across different communities? So we're already getting into all the questions tend to overlap in some way. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, the committee's answer to this was yes. We do believe that kind of information, highly localized information to the extent possible would be informative for the rule, both generally and considering concerns for equity across differentially exposed communities. There are lots of estimates in literature suggesting that exposure to vehicle emissions near major roadways increases premature adult mortality, infant mortality, childhood asthma, and other negative kind of endpoints such as violent crime. And in addition, there's evidence that these effects are differential, that negative effects of vehicle emissions from roadways on infant health, for example, are larger for low income than for high income households. In addition, there's less specific evidence on kind of heavy trucks per se, right, which is the target of the rule. But there's a good recent paper showing that reducing diesel emissions from heavy trucks, even if they're replaced by a similar flow of light duty gasoline vehicles, reduces cardiovascular and respiratory hospitalizations and deaths. So our sense was the kind of literature suggesting that taken together, households in close proximity to major roadways suffer differential health effects, and that those effects could raise significant EJ concerns. We applauded the EPA for addressing these concerns thoroughly in a qualitative manner in the RIA. So there is a lot of discussion. We had some suggestions about additional papers to cite and so on, but we noted that those concerns were not adequately addressed in the modeling, right, that supported the development of the rule's health benefit estimates in the regulatory impact analysis. And so we offered some examples of that, but echoing Dr. Annenberg's discussion of the spatial resolution of NO2 data, this kind of the air quality analysis for the rules done at the county level, right, and analyzing air pollution impacts at a finer spatial scale would almost certainly be informative for the demographic analyses that are performed in the RIA and that kind of undergird, any analysis with respect to environmental justice. So we had a couple of recommendations, again, mindful of the timeline of the rule. For the current rule, we recommended that the agency cite the literature that we described and carefully discuss the likelihood that the aggregation that they are kind of pushed to do in the rule impairs their ability to analyze its local impacts, which is a key EJ consideration. And then for future analyses, we suggested that they should estimate impacts within a small distance of roadways, large roadways, perhaps doing so just for the urban areas that are most likely to be affected. The agency has nice kind of tables of, kind of most likely effects in specific urban areas in order to better describe its likely differential impacts by race, income, and other characteristics of exposed populations.
Thanks. So I would then turn to SAB members for changes or additions to the response to charge question 2.2. Go ahead, Florence.
So the report is well written and the recommendations are good, but I think there should be a lot more emphasis on cumulative effects, which we've talked about, throughout yesterday and today. And of course, they also highlighted the disproportionate impacts of all of this air pollution on the same subset of populations that we have talked about in the lead and copper rule. So highlighting a lot more on the cumulative impacts so that those communities will be prioritized, and then also the monitoring and assessment will take that into consideration. And so because those people are impacted by all of the things, heat island effects, and in addition to the air pollution impacts and all of the health effects that you just mentioned. So those become complicated and exacerbated when you combine all of the other factors together. And so I think that should be highlighted.
Do you have specific places in the report where you feel that would be? Is it with this particular charge question is where you'd like to see that content sharpened up, or somewhere else?
Yes, and this charge question, and I think there's another one there where the charge question too, I believe they could also be incorporated into that. And the just recently released Biden Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan actually also it's a way of kind of looking at that. So it's already been a priority for the government. So, but it needs to be highlighted in the EPA plan as well.
All right, so I think the comment is just to take a look at that response, try to sharpen up that content and try to highlight those points a little more, make them a little more salient. Thank you. Others on 2.2. I think we'll move to 2.3 then. So I'll ask Dr. John Samet to summarize the response to charge question 2.3. The question is, can benefits be estimated for the reduction of NO2 as for PM and ozone in this rule for children's asthma or other adverse health effects? Go ahead, Dr. Samet.
Okay, thanks, Alison. And I will say I teamed with Enid Neptune in writing this, and I think it incorporates sort of her perspective as an asthma researcher. Of course, the answer to can benefits be estimated? The answer is always yes. But I think here we'll put a lot of buts to that. So we wrote a fairly lengthy response to this charge question, and I'll just point out its components. So first is the question of what we know on the biological plausibility side. And again, we're treating here, talking about NO2 per se, and then we'll come back to NO2 as the representative of the traffic mixture. So some discussion of that, and then a fairly lengthy discussion of some of the challenges of addressing whether an incident asthma, someone has developed incident asthma, i.e. new asthma, and for the epidemiological studies that have addressed asthma and air pollution, it's just a challenge because of sort of the multiplicity of outcome measures used and some of their limitations. So we go through some of that literature and cite some of the epidemiological studies and provide some discussion. A complexity with the estimation is that you would want, of course, an estimate of effect to use for calculating the benefits. One challenge in trying to sort out what are the, quote, independent effects of NO2 is that, for one, it exists as part of this broader mixture of traffic-related air pollution. Typically, so in urban settings in particular, NO2 is proved a useful indicator of exposure to traffic-related air pollution. I'll say trap hereafter. But there's this question of interpreting associations as to whether effective relate to NO2 itself or this broader complex mixture. Additionally, NO2 is, of course, a PM contributor and an ozone precursor, making it complicating further unraveling what the independent effects of NO2 might be. There have been a number of reviews of this, and if you move on through the response, we cite the 2016 Integrated Science Assessment, or ISA, the Health Effects Institute, which had done a systematic review on traffic-related air pollution, a workshop at the American Thoracic Society, and the WHO air quality guideline review. And I think, again, just to show how different groups have looked to this evidence. And I think in general, there's agreement that NO2 is a useful indicator of the traffic-related air pollution mixture. So moving on to the recommendations, which is on page 7 of the report, we say that, yes, benefits could be estimated from the epidemiological data. The complication really lies in interpretation of these benefits as to whether or not they represent an independent effect of NO2. The benefits are calculated in the risk impact assessment for PM and ozone. So in a sense, there may be already some acknowledgement there or capturing of some of the benefits of NO2 reduction that are mediated through changes in ozone concentration and PM concentration. We suggest that if this analysis could be done, that it could be supplemental to what has been done, and the uncertainties for any such analysis would be much greater in terms of where the evidence stands, the tools stand, comparing what has been done for ozone and PM. And again, I think the response sets up sort of the context, the uncertainty context for interpreting the results. There will be further looks at NO2 with 2016, the last NO2 ISA. There will be another, and there's the sort of the conundrum of sorting out an effect of NO2 by itself, independent of its surrogacy for the traffic mixture and its contributions to PM and ozone will remain. I mean, these are sort of inseparable by the nature of the way nature is. And I think we have to be very careful when we try and model these complexities using, regression models and sort of the usual approach of putting interaction terms into models that are difficult to interpret. And this will come up later when we talk a little bit about the multi-pollutant challenge. So I'll stop here. And I don't think Enid is with us to add in. So
let's see, Dr. Neptune, are you with us? Do you have anything to add? Otherwise, we'll look for comments from SAB members on charge question 2.3. And thanks very much, Dr. Samet, for summing it up so carefully. Dr. John Morris, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought this was very well written and gave a balanced view of the complexities of the situation. So this gets to what I mentioned before. What I thought was missing was anything on concentration response. I mean, would it be possible to put something in, maybe in that part where you cite the ISA, that, the health effects and the WHO, just to say something like these agencies suggest there may be health effects at exposure concentrations of X part per billion, or just something? You can relate it to what these other agencies suggest?
Well, I guess what we won't have is estimates. Well, I'd have to go look for childhood asthma. I mean, that's part of the issue. I think if I guess the risk here would be singling out any particular study and risk coefficient is the right one to use without sort of doing the background, I would say, more systematic approach. So that would be my thought about a reason for not doing that here. I don't know. It looks like Susan's going to weigh in. There have been meta-analyses and that could be cited, and maybe that's where you're going. But let me leave things for Susan.
Go ahead, Dr. Annenberg.
Great question. Thank you, Dr. Samet. Yeah, there have been meta-analyses for NO2 and also for pediatric asthma and NO2 that we can pull out the numbers here. I totally agree, Dr. Morris, that would be helpful to include. For the purposes of an EPA RIA, typically they would want to use US and maybe Canada specific studies. So perhaps they would want to do their own review and meta-analysis, just limiting the studies to those regions. But at least for the purposes of this report and response, having some information from those meta-analyses that are more global in nature would be helpful.
I've got another, if we can
Go ahead, Dr.
keep it.
Morris.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Just refer it to them, and then we're not making a stance, but we're giving an anchor for people to see where we're coming from. I wonder if it would benefit clarity of this section is if we had yet another explicit sentence, you know, at the end, because John, you highlighted all the complexities, especially with separating out trap from NO2 and concentration response. So could we add a sentence like it's possible that data or methodologic limitations preclude, you know, an assessment of the health costs and savings, just something like that, just to explicitly say we recognize this is complex and it may not be possible in the current state of the art.
Dr. Samet, what do you think about that?
You know, sort of my answer is I don't know. We didn't discuss that as a subgroup. I mean, these methodological challenges are there. I mean, I think, as I sort of ended with my comment, John, you know, the nature poses a challenge here, really. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's really the problem. I mean, if you go back and look at studies of NO2 themselves, I mean, you know, and this goes back a long way. I did a massive cohort
the gas
study.
stoves and
The
kids
gas
in the
stoves,
houses, those studies. Yeah,
sure. I did. I think the largest of those, and I hate to say it, I think the major paper was published 30 years ago. You know, I mean those studies are probably the closest we ever got. There was a long ago study in Chattanooga of a munitions plant with a lot of NO2, but otherwise there hasn't been much. And so that's the problem. I don't know, Susan, what do you think? I mean, how strong do we go here?
Well, I did want to call out that there is a pretty targeted specific sentence in here already. We recommend that the agency include benefits for pediatric asthma development from reduced NO2 and RAAs as a supplemental analysis that is described as having more uncertainty compared with, for example, PM 2.5 mortality.
Yeah, it's right in that second paragraph under recommendations, sort of the lead sentence.
Well, yeah, and there's a sentence down below that says the dilemma around separating the possible independent, in quotes, effective NO2 from the traffic mixture more broadly will likely persist. I mean, I think that's sort of the statement about they go together. I mean, that's the way it is. And so I don't know, John, whether that's enough for you.
Maybe, John, do you have something specific in either of those two places that you want to propose adding? That might be a way to think about it. So that other sentence is at the bottom of the third paragraph under recommendations.
Let me
second to last sentence, the dilemma around separating.
Yeah, it's line 42.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, the line number. And the other one's up around line 21, 22, 23.
Yeah.
How about will likely persist and may include a definitive evaluation or something like that?
Your internet's a little bit bumpy, at least to my ear. John, could you say it one more time?
Will likely persist and may preclude a definitive estimation of health costs. And what I'm trying to get at the bottom line of the question. Can benefits be estimated? You know, and it seems to me that there may be so much uncertainty and difficulty, benefits cannot be estimated. So I'm just trying to
how far do we want to go there?
How far do we want to go? I mean, if other people
kind of
don't feel that way, I'll shut up.
No, it's great to hear your comment. You know, it is teed up. The question is just how deep. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Samet.
Well, one more thought. I mean, and again, this goes back to sort of what's going to happen on the technical side and the changes in emissions and how the traffic-related air pollution mixture will be affected generally, which is, you know, probably the real story. I mean, if all these changes with NO2 reduction being sort of the centerpiece, change the traffic-related air pollution mixture, that could have broad benefit. It may be difficult to trace back. So I think if I get your point, will likely persist. And, we could just say something like, and may continue to complicate, benefits assessments or something like that.
Perfect.
Which is
That works.
Yeah, that seems
That
great.
works. That works.
Okay.
Okay, may continue to complicate benefits assessment. Yeah, that seems like a good way to thread the needle.
Okay.
All right.
That's
Yeah.
perfect. Can I ask
thanks.
one more general
course you
question,
can.
Allison?
Yes.
Since I got my finger up here.
Please do.
Are we actually recommending that they institute an NO2 standard in the heavy duty vehicle standard? I mean, it sure reads like we are. I don't know where I raised this question.
No, the next
the end?
process is completely separate. This
Yeah.
is
Okay.
not opining about the next.
I think
Okay,
at the
we'll do it at
beginning,
the
I said
end.
we defer to KSAC on standard setting. So, yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks,
I got
though.
it.
And that's why I said that at the beginning. Let's see. So thanks. That was a great discussion of 2.3. So let's turn to 2.4. And let's see. Dr. Sheila Olmsted is standing in for Dr. Ma on this one. Summarize the response. The question is, what is the cost of healthcare associated with air emissions and pollution overall, and particularly in disadvantaged communities as it relates to this rule?
Yeah,
Go ahead,
thanks
Sheila.
so much. Yes, as Dr. Cullen mentioned, Dr. Ma took the lead on this charge question. She just wasn't able to be here today. I'll summarize our thoughts here. So healthcare costs can be considered one of several types of defensive expenditures or more broadly avoidance behaviors to mitigate the impacts of pollution exposure. There's a long history of doing this. It's a partial quantification, but it could, right. One thing that we thought was a little challenging is we weren't super clear on what portion of those costs might already have been included in the health effects estimates that were currently in EPA's analysis in the RIA. So if they're already in there, right, then the answer is no, right, no further work necessary. But if they're not, they certainly could be potentially added. And in some cases, these costs can represent a non-trivial share of benefits. So there's a 2017 paper that shows that for the NOx budget program, the healthcare kind of avoided healthcare costs were more than half of the mortality benefits for that particular program. So again, there's evidence out there that in some cases this can be an important share of benefits. We suggest some studies that they take a look at. There's one in particular, I just mentioned the NOx budget program study, but there's another more recent study that estimates the causal impacts of PM 2.5 on elderly mortality, healthcare use, and medical costs in the US using Medicare data, and given, right, the sensitivity of elderly individuals to these particular types of pollutants that could be relevant here as well. So we just encourage EPA, if they're going in this direction, to use the kind of most recent information from the literature for this kind of evaluation, if it's going to do this, if it hasn't already done so. And then the second part of the question is kind of with respect to healthcare costs for disadvantaged communities. They indeed would be more likely to benefit from reductions in healthcare costs that would be associated with the rule, if in fact those kinds of costs are found. And so we think it's important to look into that. We don't have as many specific suggestions, right, kind of in the literature as to how to think about how those different costs would break out across these different types of communities. We did acknowledge some literature on health impacts of climate change and how those, right, are kind of differentially borne by disadvantaged communities. And so we pointed EPA to that literature as well. So again, in summary, just made some suggestions of how EPA could use the most current literature for this kind of evaluation and supported it as an important kind of partial benefit estimate that could potentially be additive to the mortality and other benefits that they estimate. And then pointed them to the kind of, on the differential impacts question, pointed them to the health and climate change literature for that.
Thanks for the summary, Dr. Olmsted. And I'll look and see which SAB members might like to weigh in on this response. It seems like a terrific work group effort to, point to literature, add some specifics. So that's, I think, really helpful to the agency. Dr. Irwin, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I thought this was really well done. I wanted to ask Sheila, the conversation that you have at the end in terms of making some recommendations about how to take into account climate change impacts and making recommendations, to maybe look at the U.S. Global Change Research Program report, and the EPA themselves have, their whole risk impact analysis modeling that they do. I just wondered, did you think, it seems like there's an opportunity here to push a little bit harder on that. I wondered if you guys had that conversation or not, because if, to incorporate future effects of climate change, I mean, the benefits then are just going to be even more magnified. So I just wonder what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we, as Dr. Annenberg mentioned earlier, the climate change piece came up in our discussions, but mostly with respect to this question of whether, EPA was planning to quantify them using the social cost of carbon estimates, but knowing also that, right, as Dr. Annenberg pointed out, that those, at least the current set of federal estimates don't necessarily incorporate all of the health damages, right, that the right kind of economics community more broadly, right, is quantifying in ongoing efforts, right, at RFF and at EPIC and other places. So we were sensitive on that point. With respect to healthcare costs in particular, we didn't have an in-depth discussion on that. So if you had suggestions of particular papers or other things that we could incorporate, we'd very much appreciate that, or even just different language than what we've included here.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I just maybe this goes in the section of things to consider more long-term, but a suggestion about possibly, collaborating with the folks who are doing the climate change impact and risk assessment or analysis to more formally include that kind of modeling into the assessment of benefits and costs.
Just getting a few notes on that. Thanks, Dr. All right. Thanks. And any specific language that you would like to suggest for that is very welcome.
I can pass them on, yes.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Other comments from board members about 2.4? All right, I don't see any. So I think in that case, we'll move to the report topic 3, which is environmental justice. And that would tee off with question 2.5. We have Dr. Janae Smith leading the summary of the response here for 2.5. The question is, given the known data and methodological limitations, how could the EPA consider the environmental justice impacts of this rule using the available data from the HDE 2027 proposal? Dr. Smith.
I think I may be standing in for Dr. Smith.
Oh, right. That's right. Earlier that you said as well. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So the key to this question is using the available data from the current proposal. So here we're recognizing yet again that the agency will not be able to run new air quality modeling or any new intensive computational analysis. And so what can we do with the current data that are available? And just to walk through this, this response, we felt that it was important that a deeper qualitative characterization of the current state of the literature should be brought in here. It should include, but not be limited to, those that examine associations between government sanctioned policies and practices of redlining and residential segregation, as well as impacts of the Highway Act of 1956 that specifically routed highways through communities of color, and that those should be highlighted as underlying root causes that we are of inequitable air pollution that we are still dealing with today. Second, we wanted to make sure that the language used in the environmental justice analysis was appropriate, contextually appropriate, clearly defined, and also consistent throughout the document. For example, inequities and disparities are used somewhat interchangeably, and we just wanted to make sure that those were consistent and used appropriately. There's also some specific recommendations for not using the broad category of people of color. I think when we were talking about the lead rule yesterday, this came up as well, but rather disaggregating into more specific population subgroups. Third, that we recognize that a critical limitation of the currently available data in the rule is the spatial resolution of the modeling at 12-kilometer grid size, and that's not sufficient resolution to capture neighborhood scale or even street level pollution, which could be greatly impacted by reducing NOx from heavy duty vehicles. A smaller grid would not be possible to use in the time frame available. We wondered whether the EPA had other types of modeling tools that could be used to estimate near roadway concentrations that could be brought to bear here. And then finally, the analytical approach that was used in the existing distributional analysis in the RIA separates out the highest 5% of demographic characteristics and then the remainder. And we wondered whether that was necessary, given that there's so many grid cells across the United States. There should be sufficient numbers to stratify the analysis with more specific categories of demographics as well as air pollution levels. So we had a recommendation here to acknowledge that there's a broader evidence base of the unjust distribution of traffic-related air pollution across populations. This comes from social sciences as well as the quantitative sciences, and that EPA should revise its EJ language and terminology to be contextually appropriate, again, clearly defined and also consistent throughout the document. We wondered whether there are additional modeling tools that could be brought to bear here, like near roadway modeling, and that we suggested some specific ways to improve the descriptive analysis of changes from baseline to 2045 by stratifying into more population subgroups and air pollution levels.
Thanks. And Jay, go ahead.
First of all, I agree with all the work group's recommendations for this question, and also appreciate the broader preamble recommendation on quantitative evaluation of EJ impacts. I had a kind of a general comment that focuses on this question, but maybe it also relates to your Appendix A and, well, EJ analysis of air pollution in general, from the social perspective. When we look at how chemicals move in the air and how air pollutants are modeled and air pollution modeling outputs, they are not really, they're not spatially compatible with or consistent with boundaries of census units, such as, counties, tracts, block groups for which socio-demographic data are published in terms of, shape, size, and geometry. So when the geometry doesn't match, we have to rely on sometimes unrealistic assumptions about how people are distributed, within areas, and, sometimes unreliable interpolation methods for counting disadvantaged populations, all of which could lead to inaccurate EJ results. So I was thinking how in recent years, a lot of private, well, not a lot, I guess several private vendors and researchers have developed gridded population data sets and indicators of social vulnerability that use geospatial techniques, combining census data with cadastral data on land parcels and tax lots, as well as aerial photographs and land use maps. So one good example is the US Census Grid project, which provides raster data sets in GIS format at 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer resolution at the national scales for almost all socio-demographic variables that you can get from the census or ACS. And I think it now goes up to 250 meters by 250 meters for urbanized areas or metro areas. So I think these gridded population and vulnerability data sets should provide a better spatial match with the grid-based outputs from air quality models, and might lead to more accurate results for exposure disparities and EJ analysis of air pollution in general. So I was just thinking if there was some way we can put that in this section, or maybe in the Appendix A that comes later. Just want to throw that out. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Annenberg, you're nodding. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Chakraborty. I just took notes on that, and we can certainly add it into this response. I think it's a really great suggestion. I just wanted to mention that the Appendix A, I don't think is intended to remain as an appendix. It would be something that we might want to consider incorporating into the document. So just to say that.
Thanks. I'm looking for other hands. Oh, Dr. Bond, go ahead. Go ahead, Tammy. There you are.
My internet is kind of flaky. So, when I read through this the first time, I agreed with everything that was said, and I still agree with everything that was said. But I find it kind of a list of processes which people are discovering and know about, and there's currently very little quantification about how poor could our estimates be, and is there completely insufficient evidence to try to estimate that? Because I think that could be a compelling argument. Like how bad could the estimates be? We certainly know that our spatial resolution in modeling is insufficient to capture physical spatial resolution. Do we have a sense of how much peakier the distributions are? And then that could provide some guidance for where future efforts should be targeted. I believe that somebody mentioned maybe we should just do this in urban areas or around the larger highways or something. But I feel like this document, although valuable and well-written, is just a list of processes that suggests that people should do lots more modeling and lots more development rather than targeting where we need information more.
Thanks for your comment. Dr. Samet, go ahead.
Well, just a quick comment. I wonder if Leanne has anything to say about this in terms of the measurement error models for air pollution that you and others have worked on. I mean, could they be used to get at the issue that Tammy raises, and perhaps the estimates of burden could be much higher in part if the misclassification were taken into account, depending on the error structure. So I don't know if you have comments, but this seems like a problem you've been involved with for a long time.
I mean, I think it's possible, but I think that the measurement error work is still pretty complex, and there's a number of aspects of, there's the Bergson-like and the classical-like pieces of it. The classical-like, I think you can conclude that it probably attenuates, but the Bergson-like is a little less clear, and it's a little bit more situation dependent. So I don't know that I would push for incorporating that at this time.
Okay.
One question that comes up maybe a few places is just if we note that there's a large number of grid cells, we could do further stratification. It's sort of how far are we suggesting that someone go? It's one thing to say looking at 2 strata, highest 5%, and the remainder is kind of the other end of that, but I don't know if there's anything more we can say there, or if it's just raising it as a general point. The information out there supports more, and yeah, Dr. Annenberg, do you have thoughts about that? Or I don't have a specific amount to suggest, so I'm just raising it because it's sort of in there.
And neither did we, which was why we thought that we felt it important to include in the preamble that the agency should develop a strategy around this. What are the categories that should be used for racial ethnic categorizations here? They should be consistent across agency documents, and they should reflect the latest literature, the latest state of the science. So, again here, I think that we wanted to defer a bit to the agency for the agency to develop its own strategy for this.
Makes sense. Thanks. And that is how it reads. So thanks. Others on question 2.5. I don't see any. I'm actually kind of inclined that we could take a short break before we move to the next section. I know, sometimes we get a lot of discussion on certain points and we're not sure where to expect that always, but we're about to start future regulatory action topic 1. So charge questions 3.12 and 3. We've only been going for about an hour, 20 minutes though. How about if we took a 5-minute break though? I think it might be a good idea. Tom Armitage, is that all right?
Yes, that's fine. We can
All
take
right.
a 5-minute break now.
Yeah, let's do that. I know yesterday I left people very short on breaks, which I understand was not always popular. So thank you. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. All right, welcome back. Let's get started. So we're now going to turn to the work group findings and recommendations for the future regulatory action topic 1, emission reductions. So this is charge questions 3.1, 2, and 3. And I would ask Dr. Enid Neptune to summarize the response to charge question 3.1. And the question is, how will PM 2.5 ozone and NO2 concentration disparities change if EPA achieves maximum emission reductions? Go ahead, Enid.
Yeah, we thought that there were varying constructions of the question. And in our discussion, we recognized that there was tremendous overlap kind of in our dissection of this issue with some of the areas that have been covered by the prior discussions. And so there will be some element of repetition here, but that's probably good. One way of constructing this question is to look at disparities in terms of the adverse health outcomes. And that would mean that if the rule is successful, does that mean that you would achieve kind of the improved health outcomes that are desirable and resolve those disparities? Or are we specifically talking about, are we able to resolve the levels of pollutants? And would those be achievable across the board and resolve the disparities in exposure? And we thought that the latter construction was probably the more convenient one. And with that, there were two considerations, and that is that whether the issue of targeting levels of exposure should focus on disparities in isolation, or whether it should rather focus on thresholds of exposure levels that associate with adverse health outcomes. And therefore, with that idea, there's not necessarily a need to fully resolve disparities, but rather a need to achieve kind of the target reductions in vulnerable communities that would be associated with improved health outcomes. And so some kind of background in this issue is that we know, as others have discussed, that the source of these disparities is very complex. There's a very complex provenance that, as others have said, involves redlining, land use patterns, prioritization of diversity within communities. And we also know that, that recent studies have shown that among the top 4 sources of air pollution that are kind of that account for disparities, traffic associated air pollution is among them. So the idea that if we target these particular emissions, that we might be able to achieve the health outcomes is actually quite reasonable. Jay brought up an issue that we discussed, which is that the pollutants that they mentioned in the question behave differently. They have different properties, and therefore measuring NO2 is going to be quite different than measuring ozone or PM 2.5, because NO2, as we know, has a shorter half-life, has a different kind of range of dispersal as compared to ozone and PM 2.5. But the value of NO2 is that it can be very structurally discrete, and we can define boundaries much more easily with measurements of NO2 than we can with the other pollutants. So what does that mean for us? It means that obviously we need to achieve kind of finer scale resolution and much more detailed kind of metrics of exposure. But it also means that on a certain level, we're going to have to kind of integrate these exposures in order to know whether we're actually achieving the targets that we want in vulnerable communities. The last issue, which I don't think has been brought up enough, is that the provenance for ozone and PM 2.5 is quite different than NO2, where NO2 we can link very clearly to trap exposure. The others have a much more complicated history. So we have to kind of bear that in mind as we develop policies that are in alignment with the targets that we hope to achieve with the rule. The other things that we thought were really important is that, and this is to kind of achieve much more personalized metrics, is that we need time activity data. And that would allow us to kind of reduce our kind of spectrum of exposure from a neighborhood or even a house, but to members within the home, into their lived experiences in terms of going to school, going to work, et cetera. And we haven't been provided with that type of data, which is not technically complicated, but would be incredibly informative as we try to look at these disparities and how they affect different members within a given community. We also need more widespread conflation of both the satellite and the ground level measurements. Those are not quite where we want them to be now, but those would be extremely informative. As Jay said, we try to construct these spatial boundaries that can kind of guide us in our understanding of these disparities. One of the aspects that a member of our team brought up that has not really been discussed, and I did not see this in the literature, is whether achieving these targets would actually affect relocation choices. And that means that if you actually achieve these targets, would the home prices inevitably go up and people might be priced out of continuing to stay in communities? And therefore, if we're looking for kind of ultimate health outcomes, we would have to incorporate the number of people who, having achieved the targets, actually leave and go to communities in which the targets have not been achieved. So if we could define what these migration patterns are and whether those kind of affect kind of whether these policies are successful or unsuccessful, that would be enormously helpful. And the last issue that we thought was very important is to obtain emission source partition data that we thought could create a predictive framework for these policies. These are not routinely obtained, but they're enormously helpful as we try to dissect some of the upstream kind of causes of these kind of varying levels of pollutants. So basically, in summary, we feel that if the rule is successful, if we hit these targets, they're probably going to reduce kind of the overall exposures within vulnerable communities. But it's less clear whether they would sufficiently reduce disparities. And maybe those two issues need to be tackled, approached on kind of different streams.
Thanks, Dr. Neptune. So SAB members, comments about this question? This is 3.1. There's another great set of literature cited here to help the agencies. So I think that's terrific. Don't see any further comments. We talked a little bit about disparities earlier. Oh, here we go. Dr. Chu, go ahead.
Hi, just a quick thought as to, in terms of, so it's been argued that depending on how the regulations are actually enforced, whether it's on a peak or an average basis, that that it could actually, for instance, if you regulate more on peaks, then it might actually end up increasing the average, just because people then just spread out their emissions over a longer period. And so how, I guess, was that, is that something that could also be an issue for disparities or for this question, and whether something the agency should consider as to, in terms of the mechanism of the regulation, how and potential effects on the temporal distribution, and how that might affect different communities. I'm not sure if I'm totally clear, right?
No, I think your point is well received. I guess the question is whether the peak and the average value behave similarly when it comes to kind of achieving targets. That when you see a reduction in the peak, you see a commensurate reduction kind of in and the average. And I don't know. Susan, I don't know whether you've seen that. You've had a great deal of experience with this.
Well, Dr. Chu, I think that's a really insightful question. I wonder if it actually pertains more to the NACs and the form of the NACs as opposed to these emission standards. Is that sort of the frame of mind that you were thinking?
Yeah, maybe. Okay. Mhm.
Which brings up a point that I think we've heard of several points today that pertain more to EJ considerations in the NACs, which is not the subject of this review. I wonder if it's something that we want to return to at some point. We've heard about this is a question about the form of the standard. We've heard about the monitoring and whether it's sufficient. I think there was another issue, whether there's the NO2 standard, which is not the purview of this board really, but if there's some, we may want to return to it in another context, I guess is all I'm saying.
Thank you. Just looking around the room, seeing if others have comments on 3.1. All right, I think we will move on then. So we'll move to 3.2. This one is moving into multiple pollutants. So the question is, how can EPA consider multiple pollutants, i.e. combined effects of pollutant mixture simultaneously, including the potential reduction for several pollutants at the same time through proposed regulation? And Dr. John Samet is going to lead in summarizing the response. Charge question 3.2, go ahead.
Okay, and I think this is hardly a new issue. And I think we comment on that in the first paragraph. And I think some of us has been to countless workshops over the years addressing the so-called multi-pollutant problem. I think here there's some specificity that can be brought to discussion because of the key focus on a selected set of pollutants. We talk a little bit about the challenges of finding the epidemiological data that could be analyzed in a way that would lead to confidence that, in fact, truly independent contributions or the joint contributions of pollutants could be appropriately estimated. And I think this goes back to the comments earlier, for example, on the childhood asthma problem. The issue is known to the epidemiological community. I will say for the criteria pollutants, there's sort of a single focus, a single-minded focus on trying to address particular pollutants in terms of providing findings that are particularly relevant to setting the 4 elements of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. We talk about regression approaches, and then I think some of the contributions here on methods that might be considered come from Richard Smith, who was initially part of the group writing this response, and some of his suggestions are quoted here. Some of the Bayesian techniques, Bayesian profile regression, mentioned Bayesian kernel machine regression, I think an approach to deal with the dimensionality of the exposure vector, turning to sources and source-oriented approaches, which has been done. So we sort of, this would be page 14, sort of the couple of sentences beginning at line 30, that it might be possible to think this through and look at the combined effect of reductions, trying to look at all 3 of PM 2.5 ozone and NO2. We talked a little bit before about NO2, but we really did not identify a specific methodology to offer. Certainly would welcome suggestions that could amplify this. So I think this is certainly a future question that needs further refinement of our thinking and of our methodological approaches. And in the future, certainly having the kinds of approaches, data sets that are we allude to the need for could improve the situation for this multi-pollutant problem. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, and that is interesting, right? That there's it seems like there's the potential to do more there, but there's not actually papers in the literature that have specific methodology pulling together those elements. Interesting. Comments from the board? This is question 3.2. All right, I don't see any. And there are some nice suggestions here too for sort of raw material for EPA. So appreciate that from the work group. Let's see, we will then turn to question 3.3. This again is Dr. Sheila Olmsted summarizing the response. The question is, what technical tools and approaches are necessary for EPA to model population disparities in air quality and health benefits of regulations? Go ahead, Sheila.
Yeah, thanks so much. Like a couple of the prior charge questions, we really saw a lot of kind of parallels and similarities between this one and several of the others. So I'll try not to be repetitive here, and also just refer folks to the preamble, right, that discusses some of this stuff a little bit more broadly. But we basically, in response to this question, we strongly recommended that EPA develop, at least for future rulemakings, right, a strategy for systematic quantitative measurement of EJ impacts of air pollution regulations. And this relates to some of the discussions that we had yesterday as well. And obviously acquiring the right set of technical tools and approaches to support that kind of assessment of population disparities is an important part of that process. And so we had several recommendations that should not be interpreted as exhaustive, but we thought would potentially be helpful. The first is, as we've mentioned a few times in response to other charge questions, we know that aggregating pollution exposure at the county level, right, or even at the census block level or something like that, masks a lot of local and hyperlocal variation in exposure. That's a central EJ concern, and so we cite some literature on that, and then just recommend that EPA develop the capacity to model EJ impacts via kind of nationwide analysis. We've suggested a few potentially less computationally demanding approaches. Those are listed there. I won't read them all. As a second category of suggestions, ground-based monitoring data, estimates from remote sensing, land use variables, and for NO2, deterministic gradients relative to road traffic sources are kind of conventional, which are conventional approaches to measure traffic emissions. Associated pollutants are currently available tools for EPA's use, right? So there's some tools that are already available that we point to there. And then also note that, kind of similar to things that are happening with methane monitoring and other things, mobile monitoring options with vehicle mounted instruments, where we know that the problem is highly spatially heterogeneous. And the idea is to identify those places where, right, exposure is happening, at very high levels that could be more broadly utilized perhaps for pollutants such as NO2. In terms of modeling health benefits, we recommended that EPA develop models that integrate surrogate endpoints, pragmatic designs, and machine learning strategies where applicable, and intensify its focus on health outcomes with strong historical relationships to conventional outdoor pollutants, such as premature birth, low birth weight, cancer, and asthma. And those phenomena may also be differentially present in EJ communities. And then fourth, we recommended that a better understanding of the relationship between exposure, morbidity, and mortality as it varies with prior exposure, right, as Florence was talking about earlier, income and other community characteristics would be helpful potentially in assessing differential impacts of air quality, especially if the agency were to develop a kind of systematic approach for air quality regulation altogether.
Thanks, Sheila. So some really specific tools here. Comments from the board members about 3.3, modeling for EJ considerations. I don't see any on this. Oh, there we go. Dr. Kaiser, go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Dr. Olmsted, for that. One of the things I was curious about, and I think you raised this yesterday, was I noticed that the suggestion, sorry, I'm trying to pull up the exact words. but your suggestion here was to develop a strategy for systematic quantitative measurement of EJ impacts of air pollution regulations. And I was curious whether or not you discussed the potential for just an overall systematic evaluation of EJ considerations. And one of the things that I was curious about just from the discussion yesterday and today is whether or not, if we do not recommend kind of a systematic assessment, if that leaves some wiggle room for analyses that may kind of be done either intentionally or unintentionally in ways that make a policy look favorable or unfavorable, say if it's done differently for water versus air. But at the same time, I understand that there are certain settings in which maybe say an EJ analysis for lead and copper should be different than air. I'm just was curious whether or not that came up through your discussions and coming to your recommendation for this systematic analysis here.
Yeah, it's such a great point. I mean, it's hard kind of following on the heels of yesterday's discussion because, you know, I feel like what we heard from the agency was that they may not be headed in the direction of kind of coming up with something that's systematic that would be used, you know, uniformly across all rulemakings. And I think we were sensitive to that as we drafted the report and talking about just air pollution regulation, in part because SAB has now reviewed, you know, kind of a few rules, each one of which, you know, some of our conclusions have been, boy, it would be nice to see, right, the sort of a systematic approach to this piece of what's done, you know, and just again, praising the agency for having done that type of analysis in each case, but looking at something that's very, very different from rule to rule. And I think you're right that what happens is that, you know, when there aren't these kind of systematic guidelines that, you know, especially with political changes and all those things, right, that sort of seeing it differently each time, you know, can cause folks to ask questions about, you know, about those things. So I think that's a great point. I think the tension here is, you know, our committee felt pretty strongly that that was what was needed for on the air pollution side, and we hadn't had that conversation that we had yesterday prior to writing the report, and so that's, you know, what that reflects. And so I don't know whether Dr. Annenberg maybe has a different view on that, but.
Sorry, Dr. Kaiser, you can say something.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I guess, or I'll just mention one more thing. And then I was just curious whether or not you all would feel comfortable making just the recommendation that EPA consider or assess the possibility, or, you know, the benefits of potentially doing a more systematic or looking at systematic assessments across all regulations. So again, that would be not saying that they should do it, but they should consider the possibility or consider kind of extending this type of analysis to be a similar type of analysis when we look across regulations.
I think it's a really great point, and Dr. Olmsted's response was excellent too, that, you know, perhaps two things are needed. One is agency-wide, kind of more generalized guidance, and then an air pollution regulation specific set of tools and processes that are used, and perhaps that's needed in other EPA offices as well. But, you know, I can say that you know, there's cross-agency guidance for doing cost-benefit analysis, and then there's specific, this is not specific to EJ, just general cost-benefit analysis, and then there's specific tools and processes that are used to do air pollution, you know, cost-benefit analysis and air pollution regulations. The committee, I feel personally that we had a frame of mind of air pollution when we were developing these recommendations, because that was the rule that we were reviewing. So I don't know the extent to which all of the things that we put together in these recommendations are things that we would say in other areas too. But immediately there are some areas that, in response to your comment, I was just looking through the preamble and the specific bulleted considerations that we had recommended EPA include in a strategy. And some of these do clearly apply across the board. So for example, consistent agency definitions and approaches for distributional analyses. For example, spatial units of analysis, categorizations of race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. That wouldn't be specific to air pollution, that would be across the board, and others of these would be specific to air pollution. So I wonder if we want to take another look through the specific elements that we included in this list here and perhaps separate them out into things that we feel could be done at a broad agency level and others that would be more specific to air pollution.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dr. Kaiser. Dr. Aruru. I think you might be on mute. There you go.
Yeah, yes. Again, I want to really commend the report and the detailed highlighting some of the issues that we've been discussing since yesterday. But I do think that a few of the things that I think should be highlighted or included both in the 3.3 and the 3.2 section will be the proximity to other polluting factories. I know they're focusing on NO2 PM 2.5 and the other pollutants, but there are community members that are exposed to those things. But in addition to that, they live very close to other polluting factories that then make the health outcomes and the exposure disparities become even larger. So I think that those should be intentionally highlighted. So whatever tool that is used, if possible, could capture that. I also think that in the tool section, whatever method is used for data collection, and again, we talked about this yesterday, the community-based participatory method is very important because a lot of these areas that are affected, they're in very rural areas, and sometimes monitoring stations or other types of information gathering systems don't really capture them. But with the community-based participatory type of model, you can actually reach any part of the community using the community members, but with the scientists really involved. And we talked about this yesterday. So I thought that this should be highlighted in the report.
Thanks. I see Dr. Annenberg nodding her head. I got some notes on that too, so thank you. Let's see, Sheila, you're up, and then Wei Su.
Yeah, just a very quick, so Florence, that's a great, those 2 points are super helpful. I would note that we kind of acknowledge prior cumulative exposure in our 4th recommendation there as something that would be helpful, right, for EP to be able to understand the relationship between exposure and outcomes as mediated by prior cumulative exposure. But if you have other, specific language places, we could put that in or be more sharp about it. I think that would be really helpful. I just want to come back to this point about whether to go broad or narrow on our kind of preamble suggestions about developing a sort of systematic EJ strategy. And I guess, Dr. Wolverton yesterday talked about the fact that the agency does actually have just like it has overarching guidelines for preparing benefit cost analyses, it has these 2016, kind of guidelines for EJ analyses too. It's just, what we see, in those is that it's fairly qualitative. And, there's this paper we cite in the preamble by Revez and Yi that says, look, there's a lot of this that's done. It's just not done because of executive orders and agency policy and so on. But it's not done systematically. And when that happens, it's not just this question about discretion, right, and how the meaning of it and the process of it will change, right, kind of from over time. But it also makes it so that you really can't do long-term analysis of what the impacts of regulation have been on EJ outcomes if we're always measuring, right, or sort of looking at something different with each rule and so on. So I think, maybe it's a matter of giving some careful thought, within the agency to what some of the big benefits of doing this systematically might be, even though there are substantial challenges to it. And that there are some rules that are just not going to fit whatever mold, they would develop, even if it was as, narrow as saying, only for conventional air pollutants or something like that, right? So anyway, that's just my thought. Again, we acknowledge that it's done a lot. It's done, every time it's required and then some. There are agency guidelines. It's just the question of the sort of non-systematic nature of it and where that leaves the science, at the end of the day and what we can say about what EPA has done or not done to address some of these challenges.
Thanks, Dr. Olmsted. yeah, it's hard to measure progress or even get a sense of status without doing something systematic. Dr. Chu.
Yeah, thanks. I guess in looking at the preamble, I mean, especially that first bullet about impact change, I think that resonated with me because given the graphic I put together yesterday on the lead rule, and I really think that now, given that all the EPA regulations in this space are related to some sort of source or chemical exposure, that using that source to outcome continuum as kind of an initial framing of approach, and then seeing and that also brings, as I mentioned yesterday, both on where the interventions are in terms of the regulatory what the regulatory impact or whatever the regulation is trying to change, and then how that impacts along the source to outcome continuum, and then how the disparities in each of those steps along the source to outcome continuum or are distributed, both across the population. And I guess I'm going to put a paper in the chat about from 2013 that I was co-author on. That was looked up. Lauren Zeiss was the first author looking at this sort of again, all the different factors of susceptibility and vulnerability, as was discussed in these bullets, and how expanding how that provides a framework to incorporate a lot of these EJ related factors. So just something to consider. Or as you finish, I realized you guys said you obviously didn't have the benefit of yesterday's discussion before embarking on this, but I want to advocate again for having a systematic framework that sort of provides a conceptual sort of model for how to incorporate this into the rulemaking process.
Thanks. And thanks, Dr. Olmsted, for leading this section. Are there other comments? I'm just wrapping up 3.3. All right, I don't see additional. So we're ready then to turn to the appendix and also the preamble. And I know Shakobi Wilson was going to summarize those key points, but I don't see Dr. Wilson in our participant.
Got an email from him that his plane was delayed and unfortunately he's not able to be here today.
Okay, so is there someone else who would be prepared to step in?
I can not do it justice, but I'll just introduce the topic. Dr. Wilson, as we know, is a national expert in environmental justice and was unable to be on several of our committee's calls. And so a lot of this was written without the benefit of his knowledge. He did, though, submit some very thoughtful comments after we had concluded our meetings as a committee. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we did not, or at least I made the decision not to include it as part of the report, given that the rest of the committee had not seen it yet. We decided to include it as an appendix so that the full SAB could consider it, perhaps for consideration perhaps for inclusion into the main text, or now that Dr. Wilson's not here, perhaps retaining it as an appendix. But it is, he does respond to some very, in a very useful way to the question. What additional analyses should EPA consider regarding environmental justice benefits? And if you scroll through the appendix, you'll see that he has a very thoughtful explanation here about different considerations that the agency should undertake. And a lot of it is in using mapping tools, but also, sorry, I thought that might be, I thought the chat might be Dr. Wilson signing in. But also other elements of the procedural justice, restorative justice, and other types of justice. I mean, he adds a second question here: how can changing infrastructure investments impact air quality? This was one where I don't recall if it was him or somebody else who brought this up at one of our initial SAB meetings on this topic. And so it was included as a charge question, but then when we met as a committee, there was no one who had brought up this question or had the expertise to answer it. And so we had actually decided to exclude it as a charge question. And now we have the benefit of having Dr. Wilson's insights on this topic as well. So I don't know exactly how to proceed on these appendix comments. I would appreciate everybody reviewing them. You know, if there's Dr. Cullen, perhaps if there's any comments here, we can take them, or if you have suggestions on how to proceed, that would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm interested in hearing from the group. Sheila has something she'd like to say as well. You know, there's a range of comments here. Some are very general and really valuable to people who are learning about these different aspects of EJ, and then bringing it, you know, to a specific case, an example. As you move into the second part, changing infrastructure investments and how that could impact air quality, it gets, you know, more specific on, you know, transportation, electric power, et cetera. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear from the group about where to go with this. Some of it does seem more as background, and then it builds into what's more applied on this topic. But I wasn't part of the conversation, so I'm reading that as a person who was not part of the work group. Dr. Olmsted and then Dr. Chakraborty.
I would defer to Dr. Annenberg and Dr. Wilson on this, but one thing that struck me is that obviously there's some pieces of this that could just be incorporated into the preamble, but Florence made some good points earlier about incorporating some language on cumulative impacts and on procedural justice with respect to some of the prior charge questions. And I wondered whether, and she might have a view on this too, whether some of that could just kind of go right into you know, some of those areas. And I could go back through my notes from today to make some more specific suggestions, but that occurred to me that both of those points in Dr. Wilson's draft here were relevant to points made earlier by Florence as well.
Yeah, and there's some very specific content that could go, I think, into the report. And then there's some, I think, that's more general. Dr. Chakraborty. I think you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to see the emphasis on other kinds of EJ beyond distributional analysis. And this is something that I have discussed with Sakobi before in other forums. So I understand, I think, the need to bring it out here. But at the same time, something I have also discussed with him before is it's not easy to implement them in practical situations because there is no existing quantitative framework that makes it easy to incorporate them in the decision-making process. And as well as previous guidelines kind of focus primarily on the distributional impacts, right? So that will always remain a practical challenge in terms of how to bring in restorative or procedural justice. Although in theory, I understand, that they need to be included, but in practice, how it would work out, whether we can have a consistent methodology or framework or approach for doing that, I think that would need more work. But I did have a comment on the distributional part. I saw one bullet mentions the EJ screen tool and other things for the distributional justice part of it. And I think this kind of relates to a point I was trying to make yesterday. There seems to be an excessive reliance on census or American Community Survey data, which can be problematic. And one of the problems I mentioned yesterday is missing data on income or poverty status for census units in less urban areas with smaller population counts. And I think I also mentioned that even if in these areas you have income data, they often have such large margins of error, which make them highly unreliable for rigorous EJ analysis. And I'm not going to add more to that. But the second problem I also see is that with ACS data or census data, that it focuses only on the residential population. So it cannot really be used to assess daytime exposure, daytime risks, including workplace exposure. But there are national data sets of daytime population estimates that have now been developed, maybe that can be used here to address some of these gaps, as well as, now we have census tract level data on racial and economic status of workers, beyond, again, the residential people who live in a certain neighborhood. So maybe it's time to think about how these can be incorporated to enhance quantitative EJ analysis. And also, final point is I think EJ assessments of air pollution also need to consider, again, my larger point of going beyond the census or ACS, other sensitive or vulnerable groups. And I noticed that the proposed rule and the cited studies do mention schools and children, which is a good thing. But there are many other locations like daycare centers, prisons and prison populations, hospitals, healthcare facilities that are inhabited by vulnerable people that should be included for assessing the EJ impacts, especially now that these data sets are mostly available publicly and shouldn't be, too much work. Thanks.
Thanks. Some great points there. I think it's still a good question. What parts are sort of in position to be pulled into the rest of the report, and what needs to stand alone as more sort of overarching, or the preamble as well. But then there were some specific other parts of the report that some of this could go into. Let's see, Dr. Bond, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Dr. Chakraborty, I'd like to completely agree with you and also disagree, if that's possible. And so I'm not sure how to parse this report, but I think an overarching question about analyses is the inability to include some of these broader factors that are difficult to quantify. So the effect of infrastructure can be completely enabling, completely disabling, or somewhere in between. And yet that's something that's often difficult to analyze. And so, again, just a big question for the group is, how can we as a board go forward in including things that really matter, even before we have a structural quantitative framework, because our analyses are incomplete if we don't include those things. Some of the aspects of justice that we find it difficult to incorporate are also in that category. And so I don't know what to do with this particular report. Some of it could be moved forward, but I would put some of these other issues in a big, broad category of things that we should be thinking about.
Thanks. It's a great point, and it also makes me reflect back on Sheila's point earlier, just about if we try to do something and we don't have those frameworks, do we run the risk of doing it only in certain places at certain times and not holistically, and then actually not moving our efforts forward, or do we just try wherever we can, whenever we can? And I take your point. So Dr. Irwin, you may have the answer to this.
No, I have no answer. I thought it was a great point. I just wanted to emphasize it further in the sense, I think that was also the source of my question earlier, which is, we don't know what climate change is going to do to air pollution impacts. And that's a complicated area, but, is the report trying to, or should we be saying for future analysis, anything about how that could be taken into consideration? And then to go back to the beginning of the conversation, I forget who it was, raised the question of, what are the trends in electrification and how is that going to impact the projections of benefits in the report? And so these are all, I think, larger, if the report is trying to project out to 2045, which I think that's what it is trying to do in terms of the baseline analysis. How do we account for these larger factors? And there's obviously uncertainty, so how do we account for that?
Thanks. You have succeeded in amplifying the point. I'm still not sure what the sort of sense of the board is about what to do with this content. It's valuable. It spans a range from some more overarching and then some very specific pieces. I mean, one approach is to go through it and try to pull parts into the document and then leave other parts as a standalone. Dr. Emanuel, go ahead.
Thanks. And I want to qualify this by saying not only did I miss part of the preceding discussion, but this is also my first few months on the board. So I don't know if this is a strategy that's helpful or allowable, but I wonder if this board has the ability to remind EPA that we define EJ as broader than simply distributive justice and exposure. And even though we may not make recommendations around procedural justice or recognition justice or other dimensions of justice, just reminding the EPA that the definition is larger than the area where we're currently working, and that this is something that we expect the EPA to continue to work out how it can be addressed in a regulatory way without providing specific recommendations at this point, and then point to the appendix as an example of a large area where where we don't have a dashboard, for lack of a better word, through modeling or assessments or things like that at this time.
Yeah, I think that's a nice suggestion, and it certainly is possible to have some of this content stay as appendix, and it does a fantastic job of laying out all these different dimensions of EJ, which I think is great. And to pull it into individual sections almost diminishes it. But then there's other parts that I think, there's a few other, and especially in that second part, that could be pulled in to specific parts of the report. So I like your idea of keeping some parts of this standalone, and certainly we can, as a board, make that statement to EPA. I think that's fine for us to do.
And just briefly to say, my fear, and I don't know if this is a unfounded concern, is that we pigeonhole EPA into thinking too narrowly about environmental justice at this time, and then it sends us down a track where we tend to shed some of these other dimensions of justice from areas of future research.
Yeah, thanks for that comment as well. Dr. Hsu, and then Dr. Bond.
Yeah, so I think, I concur with that idea. There's a couple, one thing is that you can point it out in the memo and explain in the letter to the administrator what the purpose of the appendix is. And then make reference, and then it does need some editing, right? There's at least one sentence which isn't complete. And then, some of the, it's not all parallel structure in some of the sentences as well. And I do wonder a bit whether particularly question 1, what additional analyses should EPA consider? I think the section is actually somewhat broader than that. So I wondered whether that the title of that section should change in a way. And then I think that the other thing maybe to point out maybe in the memo or maybe in like a little intro paragraph to this appendix would be that there are things here that are beyond EPA's regulatory mandate, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be part of the discussion per se, and that I mean, like a lot of the infrastructure investments are not, controlled by EPA, but putting this into that broader context maybe is part of the purpose of this appendix to ensure that people do appreciate that, that there is a larger context, both in terms of the components of justice, as well as, beyond just the particular regulations that EPA is in charge of.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, and agreed about the title of the first part. It is very broad, and that's what I was reflecting as some of that content. Dr. Bond, and then Dr. Guckenheimer.
Just wanted to follow on Dr. Emanuel's point, and others, in that right now EPA is thinking very broadly and is very welcoming to these concepts. That has not always been the case and may not continue to be the case. And so I would advocate maybe making a recommendation for at least discussing the directions in which these additional analyses are likely to go, and setting a practice of that to the extent possible. I feel like I totally agree with the point that if they're included differentially, that there could be inconsistency, and yet the fact is that they have not been included. in many analyses, and that may have also led to inconsistency that we're unaware of. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks. Absolutely. Dr. Geppenheimer.
Hi, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I'd like to return to the comment that I made yesterday. The sort of core of the EPA's efforts to talk about cumulative impacts and to think holistically are the principles of health, well-being, and quality of life, as they've described them. And I don't think that what constitutes those elements is something that is sufficiently well spelled out that we can apply it to considerations of environmental justice. Actually making lists of the components that we think go into those principles is something that I think is a basis for proceeding to systematically approach environmental justice, as well as the other holistic efforts that the EPA is trying to make in terms of sort of changing their perspective to take into account cumulative impacts. It sounds like it's very audacious and subject to failure. But if we don't do that, I think that there are two things are going to happen. One is that every time a discussion comes up, there's going to be continuing, that there will be repeated discussion of, well, what do we really mean about this? And the second thing that I think will happen is that since we live in a very litigious environment, that whenever decisions are made, they're going to be challenged in court, and we're going to find ourselves talking about legal issues rather than scientific and social issues as to what the right things to do are. So establishing a framework in which we can have a discussion about whether things like is access to supermarkets that provide nutritious food something that is part of what we think of as environmental protection for people, or are we limited to simply looking at the effects of specific pollutants and toxins? I'm totally confused about where we are on these issues. And I think that the Scientific Advisory Board could be very helpful by giving some guidance to the EPA about what we think about these issues. Thank you.
Thanks. I know I really appreciate that comment. And we've talked about this at a few meetings of the full board. And where we have come out in the past is that we both want to, when opportunities arise within specific regulatory actions that we're looking at, both in those moments, raise these issues, and then also think more holistically, which includes our request to have EPA come and give us the briefings that they've given us, the EJ briefing, the cumulative impacts briefing, and so forth, that we want to sort of work on both of those margins. And I know that that's maybe a little bit schizophrenic in a sense, but I think there's no limit really to where we can raise these points. I think doing both of those will help us ultimately move forward. And we can think about, now that we've had those briefings, what do we want to do next in terms of the more general conversation? And then certainly don't lose the opportunity within regulatory actions as we look at them to be more specific as well. And it also is helpful to people to see examples, specific examples, as they work on specific regulatory actions. So I agree with you, and it may feel a little confusing or a little sort of back and forth, but I think I'm still inclined that we can make progress in both of these ways. And so it's possible we want to assign ourselves something. So far, we've been waiting and watching and seeing what EPA is doing. We're still learning, actually, and including yesterday, learning more about what EPA is doing on these topics. So for us to assign some self-assigned work in this area, I think until we have that full sense of what's already going on is probably a little bit premature. But yeah, I don't know if that's partially an answer to your question, but I hear your question, and I think that there are multiple strands of this, and I actually still think that it's a good idea to pursue multiple strands. Looks like you've got something to say. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I totally agree with you. And I think that asking for more systematic approaches to environmental justice is a perfect example of a situation in which as a board, we can encourage the EPA to do more than they have been doing in this regard.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think the question is just if we want to do something sort of outside of the regulation by regulation, which we do in the past, we certainly have assigned ourselves things, chosen areas and tasks for ourselves, and this is could well be another one. What the timing on that is and how much more we want to be informed about what's going on so that we make sure that we are very relevant and very sort of acknowledge what's going on and then be able to build on that. Dr. Shu, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to, I fully support Dr. Guggenheimer's sentiments, and I think the issue is it's much broader than EPA. It's really, I know people have read some of these accounts of public. I mean, it's a really public health in general, how it's become sort of more medicalized rather than in the early days, focus a lot more on social determinants of health. A lot of environmental justice is related to social, social and economic determinants. Again, I'm putting a couple of links in the chat.
Thank you.
But I think perhaps it does bear some comment, but I think it needs, not necessarily just stuffed into an appendix in this particular report, but something broader to think about whether some broader recommendation from the entire chartered SAB.
Yeah, with the ability and the opportunity to be looking specifically at that, not just within the context of a regulation. Although I don't think we should stop doing it within the context of regulation, because that's definitely a great pathway for us to get information and communicate.
Yeah, I think that the SAB is probably much too limited an organization to really take this on in this sort of context. One can imagine National Academies committee doing this, but even that seems to me that it's perhaps a little bit limited in scope. One organization that we might approach with this, although I'm not sure how we would do that as a government body, is the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It's a totally independent organization and has done lots of studies on very large issues, things like graft and corruption internationally, nuclear weapons, and so forth. And the future of higher education in the US. It seems to me that having them try to put together some sort of study might be a useful thing to do in order to help these conversations along. I think it's a long conversation.
It's a long conversation. Yeah, and I shouldn't have implied that we would break it completely open, because that's not actually our scope. We would be looking at the scientific and technical basis that supports sort of the frameworks and the approaches that can be used. We would not be, much as I'm sure many people on this board would love to tackle EJ much more holistically, our scope is kind of a slice of that. So I appreciate your comment about some of these other bodies that really have those scopes that are much broader, because that is certainly true. Yeah. So why don't I will talk to the staff office a little bit more about, sort of what else we can be doing on the bigger question, as well as, we'll continue working every time we look at individual actions. We'll continue, taking that opportunity to say more specific things. It's a conversation we're going to keep having. It's not a box that we're going to check and say, okay, we're done with that. We're moving on. So I fully expect that every time we have a chartered board meeting, we will have a conversation about this. But let me talk to the staff office a little bit too about sort of channels. And I really appreciate them bringing EPA to us with the briefings that we had. I think that was a good step in sort of getting a little further ahead and understanding what's already going on so that we can think about, how to build on that and how to support that with the technical and scientific side, which is really our side of it. So I'm realizing that I left us hanging a little bit in terms of summarizing the preamble. I think we've already, now I'm going to lose track. I think we've already summarized a bit about the appendix. And let's see, Dr. Annenberg, you did that, right? Yes.
Summarize the preamble?
Not the preamble, but you did the appendix. I'm just trying to make sure we're all on the same page. Yeah. So, and we've talked a bit about the preamble, but we haven't actually turned to it. And so I think we need to formally do that in our conversation now. And I'll raise a few points about the preamble. And it's not super long. So there's some really key points that can be highlighted. That SAB strongly recommends that EPA develop a strategy for systematic quantitative evaluation of EJ impacts of air pollution regulations. And we've certainly heard sentiment that some folks would like to certainly extend beyond air pollution regulations, but in the context of what we're doing right now on this particular report, that's appropriate. That the SAB recommends that EPA consider what new information could be incorporated in the RIAs, the regulatory impact assessments, to advance past the typical 12-kilometer modeling of PM 2.5 and ozone to really too coarse to capture neighborhood scale impacts and excludes other pollutants that are more inequitably distributed, such as NO2 and black carbon. Third, there's some very specific recommendations that are provided for developing a plan for including distributional analyses in regulatory impact assessments, but certainly those are augmented by the content in the appendix, which extends far beyond the distributional side of EJ. So I'll just, turning to the preamble as a group for a moment, are there other things that the SAB members would like to highlight, to comment on in the preamble? We've had some suggestions about being careful about the memo highlighting some of this content, specifically both appendix and preamble information. So we'll certainly try to sharpen up language there. But and Dr. Annenberg, I'll turn to you first. I know that I did a very cursory job of the preamble summary. Are there other things you would like to say in terms of summarizing that preamble?
No, I'm sorry. I looked like I was reading something quickly. No, you did a great job. I was just looking through my email and realizing that Dominique Vandermensbrug had a comment in my email. I don't know if you want to raise it or I can for you.
You can. I'm not sure. I'm not in my email right now, so maybe you could. Thanks.
I was asking Dominique if let's see,
Dominique, where are you?
The preamble has a recommendation to use the social cost of greenhouse gases to value the climate benefits. And the comment was that it's unclear to what extent the social cost of carbon captures health benefits. At least one of the models that is used to construct the existing social cost of carbon fund does formally identify health effects as one of the channels, at least to climate change based damages. The other models have an aggregate damage function that could be capturing health damages, but health is not identified as a separate channel. And there was some recommended language. While the social cost of greenhouse gases has its limitations, this committee strongly recommends that the agency include the valuation of climate benefits in the final rule, as the agency stated they intended to do in the notice of proposed rulemaking. And I do want to point out that very similar language actually is in there, because I completely agree, and I think several of other of the committee members agreed that the social cost of carbon is a very limited metric, as I think it was Dr. Olmsted mentioned earlier too, that there's a lot of research going on in the economics and other communities about the health damages of climate change that are not currently included in these social cost of carbon metrics. And so I didn't pull this forward in my slide that I presented at the beginning on the preamble, but it does say, the preamble does say, while the social cost of greenhouse gases is a limited metric in that it inadequately accounts for the health damages of climate change, this committee strongly recommends that the agency include the evaluation of climate benefits in the final rule, as the agency stated they intended to do in the notice of proposed rulemaking. So I just want to point that out, that we do specifically say that the social cost of carbon is a limited metric because it does not include many of these health related damages.
Thanks, and that's a nice point. If anyone, including Dominique or anyone else, wants to think of any ways to sharpen up that language or edit that a little bit, you know, building on the spot that's already there, I think that would be a welcome contribution. But go ahead, Dr. Olmsted.
You know, the only thing I would add is that, you know, whatever is the federal social cost of carbon, you know, that is what EPA has to use for this kind of evaluation. And so they're a little bit stuck. And that's why I appreciate the language, the way it's drafted, which is to say, and, you know, I'm totally aware, right, that EPA staff who work on the interagency working group, right, on developing and revising and refining those estimates are fully aware, right, of the shortcomings of the measure. And so I think having the language the way it is sort of helps us push them, which they know, right, in this direction of revising and refining, but also recognizes that that is the measure, right, that you know, that needs to be used in the regulatory analysis process, because that's the kind of, right, the one that's used, that gets used across the whole federal government for that purpose. So I'm comfortable with the language the way it is, but would defer to Dr. Annenberg and others if it needs to be changed.
That's a compelling argument for keeping it the way it is. I don't know. Susan, what do you think? Oh, and I heard someone, but I can't see where they're coming from.
Allison,
oh, there you are, Dominique. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on Highway
worries.
65. So the question is the word inadequate. The issue is we don't really know whether it's inadequate or not, and that's what's trying to be refined in the current work on improving the FCC. So I would just leave the language pretty bland there, which is why I had proposed a different wording rather than be more specific and say identifying that it's actually inadequate, because we don't really know.
If I may, could you say a little bit more about what you mean by we don't really know? Because I think there is quite a bit of literature saying that the health damages of climate change are significant, and we do know that they are not included.
Absolutely. What's in that? We don't know to what extent the SEC picks that up or not. So as I say, one of the models picks it up directly. That's the fund model. The others have these aggregate damage functions, which in principle are picking up the health impacts. We just don't know to what extent.
Sheila, go ahead.
Thanks. I was just trying to raise my hand, but I couldn't find the reactions.
That's all right. I can see.
Yeah, so I appreciate the point very much. I guess what I would say is that, you know, the recent publication by Tama Carlton et al. And the QJE and lots of other work, right, showing just the kind of temperature mortality relationship and just the estimates of, right, premature mortality related to increasing temperatures already comprise, right, the kind of lion's share of what the existing, you know, kind of federal estimates are, would suggest that as those estimates get refined and revised, that number is going up largely because the kind of current estimates underestimate health damages. But that's my interpretation, and I certainly think we could discuss more. But I think that's, you know, the purpose of that whole kind of epic effort, right, to redo these estimates from the ground up with micro models and with Carlton and her group, as well as what's, you know, the estimates that were just released in a scientific paper at RFF, is to get at least that temperature mortality piece right. And again, even these newer estimates might not, you know, be comprehensive enough on all aspects of health damages related to climate. But I think they're getting closer, and I think that's been the area where folks have focused on, you know, fixing first, because those damages are such a big share of the whole number.
Thanks for that point. I was just rereading the language for those who weren't there. It's page VII, so 7 in the early part, and it's lines 14 through 17-ish. A little starts a little higher, maybe 12 to 16. it seems like we're probably in the right place right now on that. But I'd be curious if there are other, Dr. Annenberg, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm inclined to, I think even if we don't know the specific whether or not there are specific health outcomes in some of these integrated assessment models, I think there have been papers that have come out recently reviewing them and showing that there are climate health damage pathways that are not currently being included. Even if they were being included, we as a health community don't have a great capture on the full health damages of climate change yet. So I think the current wording leaves it open to, it still is true whether or not these models are reflecting the state of the science, which I think is unlikely in terms of the climate health pathways, given what I know of the scientific literature. And so I would be inclined to leave the wording as is, but I think either way, we're saying the same thing, that this metric is limited because it is not including it is inadequately including the health damages.
Would it be helpful if we included some citations to those papers?
Yes.
Maybe that would help kind of bridge the gap. Okay, I can
That's
email
a great idea.
those, and maybe I'll copy Dominique when I send those, and then he can weigh in as well.
That's a great idea.
Sounds
All
good.
right. Thanks. Yeah, no, that's a great conversation. And I think we're in a good place right now. Any other thoughts about the preamble? Dr. Morris.
This is just a quick one. The last bullet on page VI starts out with something that's not a sentence. The above considerations balanced with data and computational limitations that could hinder EPA from producing timely analysis for NAAQS reviews and regulations.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we'll
I think
need
if you
an
take
edit
out
there.
the that,
Yeah, I think you're right.
you've got what it means. It's sort of important to get that idea out. That's why I
Yeah,
mentioned
no,
it.
thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, anything else like that, please do send to Tom Armitage. We're collecting little things like that. There's always some little things in reports. So thank you. All right. All right, well, I guess I'll just, again, really appreciate the work group and the incredible amount of work that went into this and all the comments from members. And certainly we've all been taking notes, so do send your updated language or your specific sort of text suggestions. I know Susan's got some, I've got some, I think Dr. Olmsted's got some as well. Yeah, but again, really appreciate that. Go ahead, Dr. Annenberg.
Just a procedural question, as I'm new to the SAB, is there any ways to get agency input on clarifications, things that aren't clear, so that we can make sure to improve it for their benefit?
Good question. Tom Brennan, what kind of an approach would there be? I mean, I think we usually, if something's not clear to us, we comment on it, and then that's considered that if they do know better or know more, which of course in many cases they might, that's just we've reflected the confusion that could be out there, or the lack of clarity that could be out there. Are there specific things that you would like to have answered before?
I'm not sure if I fully understand the
Yeah,
question,
go ahead.
but I will say that it would be appropriate to ask a clarifying question, and if it helps you write your report more clear, that working through Tom Armitage, I think that would be fine.
Yeah, I think if it's a smaller thing, I mean, some of these questions are like these huge overarching questions about approaches and frameworks, and some of the, I think those.
I was picturing a smaller question.
Yeah, the smaller ones.
Clarification would be fine.
Susan, what did you have?
Yeah, I meant more if the people in the agency read this draft and have questions about what we mean, could they flag that for us so that we could improve our?
I think that'd be a great conversation, and I think the staff office can be a conduit for those kinds of back and forth questions. Yeah. They may well ask back to us, and including, I mean, when we had the briefings yesterday, they were responding to things we'd said and trying to sort of keep a back and forth conversation going. So, Tom, I think that would be a great thing for you to listen for.
Absolutely, and Allison, I think, summarized it very well, is that what is happening in this meeting yesterday and today is just one stop on a longer conversation, which I'm sensing is building, and I think that's great.
Yeah, thanks for that question. All right, well, huge thanks to the work group and certainly the leadership of Dr. Annenberg and all the comments that we got today. Really appreciate that.
Allison,
Yeah, Tom.
before we move to the next topic, I just
Mhm.
wondered, could you get the board to approve the report with the changes discussed so we can move ahead with it? Because we're going to send it back to members for final concurrence, but at this meeting, I would like, if you want to take a voice vote or whatever you want to do it, to approve the report with changes discussed.
Yeah, certainly. So I think that I mean, I have lots of notes, but many of them are, we didn't have anything that was sort of a huge change. We had some text changes that were suggested by folks, and we've got notes about those. So I think I would just ask for a motion to accept the report, right? The motion would come from the members, would it not? And then we can call it to a vote.
Yes, it would.
So,
I was going to move that we accept the report with the changes.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I second.
Thank you. All in favor of accepting the report with the changes that we went ahead and noted and will be making progress on? You can unmute, and all in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? And any abstentions? And Jay's you've got your hand up, Jay. Are you voting? All right, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah,
Tom,
before we move on,
yes.
there was a message from Richard Smith this morning that was distributed asking that this topic be left open for deeper, more extensive study, particularly with regard to the issues involving climate change. Is that something that we should consider, or is that something that the group that decides on what issues the SAB should take up should decide?
Yeah, good question. Richard was not able to join us, and I will reflect my understanding, and then I'll turn to Dr. Annenberg. My understanding is that Dr. Smith was part of the work group and did raise some questions related to climate and climate impacts that the committee did think about. And there's some content in the report that reflects his contributions. I think he had to step away due to some other commitments and responsibilities. And I'm on the West Coast, so I think something showed up at 6 a.m. this morning for me right before I was getting ready to come over to go to this meeting. So I did not have any additional insight about the conversation, but Dr. Annenberg, is there something more that I should understand about? There was certainly input, I know, early on from Dr. Smith.
I also apologize. I had to skim his note while watching my kids this morning, so I'm trying to recall the specifics. I thought that he was suggesting to leave open the topic, in addition to climate change, leave open the topic of the EJ analyses, recognizing that this committee had to perform its work in a very short time frame, and that there were some other additional considerations that required more time. But I need to open that and take another look.
Yeah, I guess I would reflect what I was expressing earlier. I think the EJ conversation is certainly open and will continue to be open throughout all the actions that we look at. And I think including, we may end up assigning ourselves or engaging in some broader exercises with EPA and some broader conversations with EPA about EJ. So certainly that topic remains open. I think this came in at 6 a.m. here on the West Coast, and those of us out here were getting ready to go to this meeting. So I don't have more to say about the climate side of it. John Samet, go ahead.
I think the other thing he mentioned was we didn't say much about the rule itself, and option 1 and option 2 was one of his points. I guess when I read it, I think we all agreed in the subgroup on the importance of the climate, and then this question of what could be done now. It seems to me that that the points he raises have merit, but that given time frame issues, I don't see that there's sort of things that we could have do as a subgroup that would be immediately different or relevant. I mean, that was sort of my impression on reading, but I think his other set of comments was basically about option 1, option 2, and not saying much about the rule itself, which is not exactly what we were supposed to do. We were supposed to evaluate the regulatory impact assessment, the RIA. So I thought that, in my view, was a bit out of scope. So
I will, yeah, I appreciate that very much. I will suggest that I and Dr. Annenberg maybe put our heads together and actually look through this. As I say, we received it this morning, but just make sure that if there's something additional that the work group should be thinking about, or if we should be extending work. But I didn't get that sense just based on what I knew of the input that he'd had earlier on, and then that the group had discussed those contributions and sort of decided what was in scope and what was beyond scope. Dr. Neptune, you may have additional information because you're on the work group. Go ahead.
Oh, actually, it's a different issue than what John brought up. So I don't know if others wanted to comment on what John mentioned.
I don't see other hands. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay. And this goes back to when we were talking about the broader expanse of the environmental justice kind of concept and what was provided by SAB in his appendix. I was a little hesitant to bring this up because I'm not sure that we need to weigh in on this, but I was concerned that this expansion of the whole concept of environmental justice beyond the specific kind of mandates of the EPA, at least the way most people envision those, would that kind of encroach upon some of these kind of major questions, parameters that have been kind of basically restricted by the Supreme Court. So I didn't know if we were inviting kind of more kind of commentary about the kind of expanse of our regulatory spectrum by using environmental justice in this manner. It may not trigger that kind of concern, but I was just wondering if it might.
It's a great question, and I really appreciate you raising it. I feel like having some of the content in an appendix to the report, because it sort of expands beyond, is a way to try to distinguish what we think is in scope for this particular regulatory action, but things we still thought were important to communicate about. It sounds like you may think that some of that should just wait for other occasions and other avenues for communication. Am I?
Well, I don't know whether EPA has kind of informally decided that they don't want to poke the bear, and this might be kind of a pilot poking, if it will, because I mean, I love what SAB did with the appendix, but it's incredibly aspirational, and it pushes boundaries of what this particular agency is focused on historically.
You're absolutely right. I noticed Tom Brennan turned his screen on. Did you want to add something, Tom?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I don't speak for the whole EPA, but I'm a member of the EPA and then a liaison to this body, and I think that you're fully within your scope to offer scientific advice that supports rules, and I think that what you're doing here is appropriate, and like everything that comes out of the SAB, it's advice. Some of it might be aspirational advice, and some of it might be things that are actionable right away. And both of those categories of types of advice are very helpful to EPA. And I'm sure that they'll welcome the advice in the spirit of which it's given.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom. All right. We've heard from the working group. We've reviewed the report. We've voted on that. We have a number of changes that will be made and some edits. And then we have information and thoughts for continuing work and continuing this conversation about EJ. So I think we've had a good success here. And we can move on to our next agenda item. I think we should take a 5-minute break first, though. I was trying to leave little breaks every hour and a half or so. So let's take a little 5-minute break, and then we're going to turn to the recommendations from the work group for a review of science supporting EPA decisions. And we have 11 of those, which is quite a few, but we'll be as efficient as we can. So see you all in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Going to reconvene. All right, welcome back. So I'd like to turn now to discussing the recommendations that we received from the SAB work group for review of science supporting EPA decisions. And first, I'll briefly review the responsibilities of that work group, as we always do. The SAB is required by law to receive information from EPA about science supporting planned regulatory actions when those actions are provided to any other federal agency for formal review and for comment. And then the board may decide to review the adequacy of, in particular, the scientific and technical basis of the planned regulatory actions. So the work group is playing an important role in this process. It's sort of screening those many regulatory actions and making recommendations to the full SAB about whether there's a need to review the science supporting planned actions or not. And we have a monthly meeting. So the work group was formed in November of 2021. We've met basically monthly since then. The members are myself as chair, David Allen, Barbara Beck, Jay Chakraborty, Stephen Hamburg, Celine Hernandez Ruiz, Marcus Hendricks, Sheila Olmsted, Christy Pullen-Fedenik, Amanda Rodewalt, John Samet, Peter Thorne, and June Weintraub. And we met, as I say, monthly, but in particular on July 29th, August 26th, and September 30th of 2022, and also October 27th, and developed recommendations concerning SAB review of science supporting 11 planned EPA actions. And I'll mention what these actions are, and then we'll go through them one by one. There are also quite a few actions that we flag and bring forward and have much longer discussions with the board about, including we just talked about heavy duty trucks and vehicles. So, you often hear about the ones that we do flag. These in particular from the work group are deemed and recommended not for further review, but the board is certainly open to discuss that and decide. So the first one is effluent limitations, guidelines, and standards for the steam electric power generating point source category. This is RIN 2040 AG 23. The second one is proposed finding that lead emissions from piston engines used in aircraft cause or contribute to air pollution that may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. This is RIN 2060 AT 10. Third one is oil and natural gas sector emission standards for new, reconstructed, and modified sources, and emissions guidelines for existing sources, oil and natural gas sector climate review, RIN 2060 AV 16. The fourth one is phase down of hydrofluorocarbons, updates to the allowance allocation and trading program under the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act for 2024 and later years. That's RIN 2060 AV 45. Fifth one is phase down of hydrocarbons, restrictions on the use of certain hydrofluorocarbons under subsection 1 of the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act of 2020, RIN 2060 AV 46. We're almost halfway through. Sixth one, prevention of significant deterioration, that's PSD, and non-attainment new source review. Reconsideration of fugitive emissions rule, that's RIN 2060 AQ 47. Seventh, we have implementing regulations under 40 CFR Part 60 Subpart BA, adoption and submittal of state plans for designated facilities. That's RIN 2060 AV 48. Eighth, we have reconsideration of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for particulate matter. That's RIN 2060 AV 52. Ninth, we have standards of performance for steel plants, electric arc furnaces constructed after 10/21/74 and on or before 8/17/83. Standards of performance for steel plants, electric arc furnaces, and argon oxygen decarburization constructed after 8/17/83. That's RIN 2060 AU 96. 10th, we have fees for administration of the TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, RIN 2070 AK 64. And finally, 11th, changes to reporting requirements for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, community right to know toxic chemical release reporting. It's RIN 2070 AK 97. I wrote a memorandum to the board dated October 5th, 2022. It documents the work group's recommendations and provides background information about these actions. The work group found that none of the 11 planned actions warranted further review by the SAB. That's a recommendation. So I would now like the board to discuss that recommendation and reach agreement on any actions as needed. Before we discuss the recommendations, I'd like to ask board members if anyone has any questions about this process. Don't see any. All right. So I know this part is a little dry, but we will, as part of our process, we do need to go through individually and discuss each one at least a little bit, and the recommendation that was made by the work group, and then vote on each one. So that is the process that will follow. So first up is RIN 2040 AG 23. I read all the titles earlier, so maybe I'll just give the RIN numbers. So this is the first one. EPA is revising the effluent limitations guidelines and standards for steam electric point source category to establish more stringent wastewater discharge standards. And this is for 4 waste streams: flue gas desulfurization wastewater, bottom ash transport water, combustion residual leachate, and legacy wastewater. EPA is preparing a series of support documents. These documents include first, a technical development document that contains details of the engineering costing analysis, pollution reduction analysis, and treatment technology assessment. Second document, an environmental assessment document that summarizes the potential environmental and human health improvements that are expected to result. Next, a benefit cost analysis that summarizes societal benefits and costs expected to result. Fifth, the regulatory impact analysis that summarizes estimated costs and impacts, an environmental justice analysis, finally, that presents a profile of the communities and populations potentially benefiting from the proposed regulation. The work group looked at the action, recommends that it does not involve scientific approaches that are new to EPA, and that the SAB review of planned action is not warranted. So I'd like to call for discussion and then a motion to either approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation of no further review. Anyone like to discuss this action? I see no hands, so I would ask if there is a motion to approve the work group recommendation.
Don't move.
I'll give the number again. This is for RIN 2040 AG 23, just so we're clear. I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed? And any abstentions?
Abstain.
Thank you. All right, the motion carries. Work group recommendation of no further review. Second up, we have RIN 2060 AT10. This rule is a proposed finding that lead emissions from piston engines used in aircraft cause or contribute to air pollution that may be reasonably anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. In support of this planned action, EPA is analyzing air quality modeling and monitoring information to make that determination. The work group noted that there have been previous peer reviews of the assessment of lead toxicity by the SAB and other organizations, and found it's not necessary to revisit this issue. Some of the data used to support the EJ analysis could be updated, but the work group found that the analysis is appropriate to support the agency's endangerment finding. So the work group recommended that EPA consider updating its 2016 technical guidance for assessing environmental justice and regulatory actions. So I now call for discussion of RIN 2060 AT10, if anyone would like to discuss. I see no hands, so I would ask for a motion to approve the work group's recommendation on RIN 2060 AT10.
So move.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you. The motion carries. And the work group recommendation of no review. 3rd. This is from the oil and natural gas sector. This is RIN 2060 AV16. This is emission standards for new, reconstructed, and modified sources and emissions guidelines for existing sources. This is oil and natural gas sector climate review. The work group noted that this is a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. It's an extension of an action currently being reviewed by the SAB. So the SAB work group recommended that the SAB just incorporate this supplemental rulemaking into the ongoing review. So on this one, we would fold that in and review together with the existing review. Any discussion about RIN 2060 AV16? All right, then I would call for a motion. The work group has recommended no additional new review, but folding this into the existing review. Do I have a motion?
So move.
Move.
Second.
Thank you for the second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions? All right, the motion carries and the work group's recommendation carries. All right, number 4. This is phase down of hydrofluorocarbons. It's RIN 2060 AV45. Specifically, it's updates to the allowance allocation and trading program under the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act for 2024 and later years. The rule will implement the HFC phase down under the Act. A prior rulemaking established a framework for an allowance allocation program for the phase down of HFC production and consumption. And the work group found that SAB review is not warranted. The rule does not involve new science and it's largely administrative. I'd like to call for a discussion. If there is anyone who has a comment about this one. I see no hands. So the work group has recommended no further review. This is for RIN 2060 AV45. Do I have a motion?
So move.
I'll motion.
Second?
I'll second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you. We've reached action number 5. This is again phase down of hydrofluorocarbons, restrictions on the use of certain hydrofluorocarbons under subsection I of the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act of 2020. It's RIN 2060 AV46. EPA is considering this proposed rule to restrict fully, partially, or on a graduated schedule the use of HFCs in sectors or subsectors, including refrigeration, air conditioning, aerosol, and foam sectors, and establishing record keeping and reporting requirements and addressing other related elements of the AIM Act. The SAB work group found that the chartered SAB a review is not warranted because the science has been established and the rules mainly related to record keeping and reporting requirements. Is there any discussion on 2060 AV46? I see no hands, so I would call then for a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation of no further review.
So move.
Okay.
Is there a second? Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, so the work group's recommendation of no further review of RIN 2060 AV46 carries. Move to number 6. We're more than halfway there now, or we will be at halfway. This is RIN 2060 AQ47. This is a PSD and non-attainment new source review, reconsideration of fugitive emissions rule. This proposed rule would repeal a rule that was adopted in 2008 under the Clean Air Act. The 2008 rule allowed certain types of existing major stationary sources to omit fugitive emissions from consideration when determining whether a physical or operational change constitutes a major modification that requires a permit under the PSD or non-attainment NSR programs. The work group found that the chartered SAB review is not warranted. The rule is a revision of a 2008 rule. It doesn't include new scientific approaches. So I would open this up for discussion first. I see no hands, and then would call for a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation of no further review. This is for RIN 2060 AQ 47.
So moved. Move.
Thank you for the motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you. We're at number 7. This is RIN 2060 AV 48. This one is titled Implementing Regulations under 40 CFR Part 60, Subpart BA, Adoption and Submittal of State Plans for Designated Facilities. The work group looked at this one, found that SAB review is not warranted. The action is mainly procedural. It's related to compliance deadlines and timelines for submitting state plans under the Clean Air Act. Is there any discussion on this action? Then I would call for a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation of no further review. This is for RIN 2060 AV 48.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any
Aye.
opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you. So we have another set coming up. I think I'll break up the monotony just by saying we have a set of screening questions that have been presented before to the full board that we use, which include is it procedural, is it administrative, is it something that CASAC looks at anyway, and we defer to them on anything about the NACs and so forth. So we have a set of screening questions that you all have seen before. That's how we get to that sort of, is review warranted or not? And you're kind of hearing that reflected in the reasoning about each of these. So the 8th one is 2060 AV 52. This is titled Reconsideration of the NACs for Particulate Matter. So case in point, it's a reconsideration of the PM NACs. The work group found that SAB review is not warranted because this is, as all NACs are reviewed by the CASAC, the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. Is there any discussion of this action? All right, well then I would ask for a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation, which is no further review from the SAB.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? Oh, thank you. Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, we have 3 remaining actions. So you're doing great. This is quite a set, 11 here. So this is RIN 2060 AU 96. It's titled Standards of Performance for Steel Plants, Electric Arc Furnaces Constructed After 10/21/74, etc. I read it originally when we were first laying out the 11. The Clean Act requires that the EPA review and revise, if appropriate, new source performance standards every 8 years. The rule in this case addresses the agency's review of the new source performance standards for particular steel plants, electric arc furnaces constructed after October 21st, 1974 and on or before August 17th, 1983, and standards of performance for steel plants, electric arc furnaces, and argon oxygen decarburization vessels constructed after August 17th, 1983. The work group again found that SAB review is not warranted. The rule does not involve any new scientific approaches or analytic procedures that are new to the agency. Is there discussion of this action? It is RIN 2060 AU 96. I see no hands. Then I would call for a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation, which is no further review.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor of approving the work group's recommendation? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Nay. Or abstentions? All right, the motion carries and the work group's recommendation of no further review is in place. 10th out of 11, RIN 2070 AK 64. This is fees for the administration of the TSCA. EPA is proposing modifications to the Toxic Substances Control Act fees and fee categories for fiscal years 2022, 23, and 24, and is explaining the methodology by which the proposed TSCA fees will be determined. The work group looked at this one, found that it did not warrant further review by the chartered board because it's largely procedural, it's considered administrative, and it's related to fees. Is there any call for discussion of this action? I see no hands. So I would ask for a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation of no further review.
Move to approve.
Is there a second?
Second.
A second.
Thank you. All in favor of the work group's recommendation, which is no further review of RIN 2070 AK 64, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. And any abstentions? All right, we're at the final action, number 11, RIN 2070 AK 97, and I appreciate your patience. This is changes to reporting requirements for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, community right to know, toxic chemical release reporting. In this action, EPA is proposing to add all per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, subject to reporting under Section 313 of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act and Section 6607 of the Pollution Prevention Act to the list of lower thresholds for chemicals of special concern. The addition of the PFAS to the chemicals of special concern list will eliminate the use of a de minimis exception, eliminate the option to use a particular reporting form, and will limit the use of range reporting. The work group found that this planned action did not warrant further review by the chartered board because it focuses on reporting requirements, and also the SAB has recently completed a review of the EPA's analysis to assess the risks of PFAS chemicals. Is there any discussion of this action? Seeing none, I would call for a motion to approve or disapprove the work group's recommendation of no further review of RIN 2070 AK 97.
Move to approve.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions? All right, thank you for your attention and thank you to the work group for screening these and doing the legwork that got us to the point of being able to vote today. Appreciate that. All right. The next item on our agenda, we have a time to hear any brief clarifying comments from EPA and members of the public. So I would like to ask Tom Armitage, the DFO, whether any requests to speak have come in and been received. Tom, where are you?
Yes, we did receive one request. However, I don't see him on our meeting. He sent me an email and said he was planning to join shortly, but we don't have him. It was Britt Carmen from Natural Resources Defense Council.
Okay.
Wanted to provide comments, but he's not here.
Yeah, no, I feel a little badly because we're far ahead of schedule. And I also don't feel badly that we're far ahead of schedule. Yeah, but in the case of public comment, it is hard to time that.
Yeah. So I guess, since he was unable to join when we were ready to take comments, we should probably move on.
Can we encourage that he submit written comments so that we can have the benefit
absolutely.
of what he had to say? Thank you.
Yes.
I appreciate that he reached out and was interested and wanted to make the time for us. So yeah, would love to appreciate that. All right, and that was the only one?
Yes.
All right. Well, in that case, I think we're at the end of our agenda. And for myself, I'd really like to thank the members of the Chartered SAB for participating in what I thought was a really productive meeting, both yesterday and today. I want to review the follow-up items and next steps. So coming out of our meeting, I will work with the DFO and develop the letter to EPA transmitting SAB comments on the consultation we conducted. And for this one, that was, think back to the beginning of yesterday, we ask SAB members to send their final written comments by November 21st, so they can be included as an attachment in that letter. And Tom Armitage will send a follow-up email reminding you to send those written comments for the consultation letter. So that's the first thing. Second, I will work with the DFO to incorporate the changes that we discussed into the SAB report on EPA's proposed heavy-duty engine and vehicle standards. Talked about that one today. And if you were suggesting revised text or had been asked to prepare a revised text, please send it to Tom Armitage, and I will ask Tom to send a follow-up email so folks can know if there's something expected from them or just that the window is open for submitting those. Really appreciate that. It helps a lot. Many hands and many pens make a stronger report. So really appreciate that. After the draft report is revised, we'll send it around for final concurrence before it is submitted to EPA so that you can check and make sure that things have been incorporated the way that you intended and that you feel that your comments have been heard and incorporated in an appropriate way. Let's see. Next, we'll implement the board's decisions regarding the EPA planned regulatory actions discussed at this meeting. So basically, there was one action that was being folded in with an ongoing review, and then the others did not warrant further review because they were either procedural or being reviewed by other panels or et cetera. So that's basically where we are. Are there any additional questions from board members?
Can I ask a quick question, Alison?
Of course.
Hi, sorry, I've forgotten where the raise hand button is, but
it's all right.
I was just wondering if there is a mechanism to respond to the comments that Richard Smith sent in this morning, which was that wasn't directly about the rule, and he wasn't saying we shouldn't approve the heavy duty rule, but he was saying kind of like the SAB should come up with its own work group to answer a question we hadn't directly been asked to answer, and probe further this question of how the EPA could, in future regulations, better characterize the health risks of climate. So I just wondered even what the options were for following up on that. Thanks.
Yeah, to the extent that we would look at that question, it would be looking at the scientific and technical sort of underpinnings of how EPA would go about doing that. We could decide as a board that we want to have a group, moving forward, a subgroup of the existing one or a different group moving forward. It is beyond the scope of what the work group that we heard from today was doing. So I think, their work was considered completed and ready to undergo this editing process that we voted on earlier, but we don't want to lose. And again, it is hard when you get something on the day of the meeting, and especially with time zone changes, I cannot do justice to that letter. It came at, as I say, 6 a.m, and this meeting for me started at 9. So I was just trying to get set up to be here, but I think it would be fine to look at that letter in some detail and see if there's something that an additional group would do, but it would definitely fall under the scientific and technical basis of what the rule would be. It wouldn't fall more broadly about. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to split hairs, but it's just
totally. That's right, because it's not really germane to any specific rule, and especially it's not exclusive by any means to the heavy duty truck rule. But I wondered if there were pathways for, say, the SAB to suggest that the EPA partner with, for example, the next interagency working group on the social cost to bring expertise that the EPA has on health impacts into that group.
Yeah, no, we certainly could. And we have assigned ourselves tasks of a similar nature in the past. But again, it would just have to make sure it was completely focused on what's in our scope. It looks like we have Richard Smith. Richard, you've joined us. Hello.
Oh, yeah.
I got your note very early this morning, Richard, so I'm not in a position to be able to reflect it completely at this point.
Okay, I apologize for, well, firstly, I literally joined the meeting just as Drew was speaking there. So thanks, Drew, for that comment, and apologize to everyone for being very late delivering that comment of mine. I guess my feeling was that this work group didn't address the questions that I thought were important. I mean, at the start, and I was a member of the work group at the start, And I mean, frankly, I had no choice but to drop out. I kept getting emails saying, please send us your review by next Friday. And it was the first week of semester, and I had a ton of queries from students and colleagues to deal with, and it just wasn't possible for me to respond on that sort of time frame. I'd be happy to re-engage with the group if there was some sense that we could continue our discussions. But I felt this report did not actually address the heavy duty rule at all. I mean, nowhere in the report does it even say what the heavy duty rule is. If you go back and look at the wording of the heavy duty rule, they have different options for different rules for different classes of vehicles. There's a lot of discussion of option 1 versus option 2, and I think the idea was that option 2 was broadly a tighter rule than option 1. There are discussions of various timeframes. I mean, what I would like to know is well, what is the impact of these different versions of the rule? And I also raised the question of climate effects, which, I appreciate the fact there were some comments on climate effects inserted into the report that SAB produced, but it's possible to do a lot more. And one specific suggestion I had, which I didn't think would be all that complicated, would be that if EPA could give us some estimates of what the CO2 reductions could be under this rule if it was implemented, then some of us might get together and try to write a report on what actual, what impact would that have on fulfilling USA's commitments under COP27, for instance. I mean, there are big picture questions out there that we're not answering. And I don't actually see myself why that would not be within the remit of the SAB. It's simply a question of, well, what specific remit do we want for this group? So my specific suggestion is, yes, let's accept the report as it is, but maybe the group should just continue and look at some broader, broader issues. Thank you.
Thanks. That helps me know a little more about what was in your letter. I think the part of what you're suggesting, there's a lot more in any action that we could always be looking at. So I completely take that point. And I know there are people all around the board who would pick different elements that they would love to dig more deeply into. The thing that I'm sort of pondering about what you just said, Richard, is it's very much for us to stay focused on what the scientific and technical basis is. So looking at like the assumptions under different options or things like that. But when it comes to balancing options against each other in terms of regulatory process and what ultimately moves forward, that's where they're balancing lots of things besides science. And we don't really get into that arena in particular. So I may be miss.
No, I don't think we should. I think we should confine ourselves to, to what is our expertise. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't, but there's nothing at all at the moment about that kind of comparison.
Mm-hmm. And we did have a pretty complete conversation earlier about the report, so I appreciate that you're here now. But I'm sorry that you missed the earlier.
Well, I'm sorry I missed it as well.
No,
I was at another EPA meeting. I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's a busy time, so appreciate your time here. I mean so we have a number of options in front of us. We have voted to accept the report, and I'm glad that you support that vote as well. We could decide that there are additional things that folks want to look into. It might be the same work group, it might be a different work group, but we do have to balance that against anything else we might want to deploy our members on, because you have made a very good case for the fact that everyone is seriously overtapped and overcommitted. And so in order to move ahead and do more on this one, I mean, we would be taking away from our ability to be taking on other questions as well. And I'm not saying that to try to be a nudge. I'm just, that's the reality of it, right? Is that, you and everyone else is seriously tapped, and we appreciate everyone's time so much. And so, doing more on this, which could go in many directions, and then there's some directions it could not go in, as I said earlier, it would change our ability to field other questions. So I'm happy to open it up the floor to the rest of the members. Most folks here were engaged in those earlier conversations, and we did reflect a little bit on your letter, but again, it came so late in the game. Dr. Annenberg and then Dr. Olmsted.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for raising your points. I want to just remind ourselves too that the EPA, this particular rule is on the fast time frame. So to the extent to which we want to get into more details about this specific rule, I'm not sure that it actually would be that helpful to the agency because of the time frame that they're on with this. To the extent we want to take on longer term questions, like for example, the health impacts and the social cost of carbon, that has come up time and time again. That's a longer term issue that goes beyond this heavy duty vehicle NOx rules Dr. Schindel mentioned as well. And I would fully support us, trying to find a way, an avenue to, to review the scientific underpinnings of the health damages in those estimates.
Thank you. And Dr. Olmsted.
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing these issues to the fore, Dr. Smith. What I would say is it's related, your concerns about the scope, right, are somewhat related to conversations we've had. We had a similar kind of partial discussion at the last SAB meeting over the, let me think if I can remember which rule this was. I think it was the PFAS in drinking water. It wasn't the report, but maybe it was the standard. In any case, part of the limitation is that we have charge questions from the agency, right? And that we're trying to stay in our lane with respect to the charge questions. But as Dr. Cullen mentioned at the start, we can also go beyond that. It's just a question of how far beyond that, right? And what is the, right? What are the kind of key issues and so on? And I think the earlier we can identify, any potential disjuncture between, the charge questions as drafted from the EPA and what the committee that's appointed to whichever kind of review we might be doing. In this case, it was the heavy duty panel, the heavy duty rule. The better off we are, right? Because then we can broaden at that point the scope and lists these additional things that we might be, want to look at, and then that tees it up so that the whole committee can do that. So I'm mindful of that kind of going forward, and would just mention that as a related point.
Yeah, and I'll build on that just slightly. So the work group talked about this question of charge questions lately because, they do define and they do tend to rule things in and out when you're trying to focus because we can't focus on everything. And there is a feeling that we need to make more space for people at the beginning of these processes to expand beyond those initial charge questions if warranted and if desired. And so I think there will be a renewed focus toward making sure that there's just a really kind of intentional space for doing that when we try to scope our work. Now on the current one, obviously we're not at the beginning, so rolling back to where we are right now. Yeah, I'm torn. I guess you can hear that. I think your points are well taken, Richard. I also think that, people are assigned far and wide already on things. And so I guess I want to be mindful about that and yourself included, that I realize that,
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Maybe I could just respond on one particular point there. Like I said, I did attend the first couple of meetings and there was never any discussion of, are these the right charge questions? I mean, we were just given this list of questions and, I've pretty much made my view clear already. I thought they were too narrow questions and we should have taken a broader perspective from the start. I realize others may disagree with that. And perhaps that would go against our mission of providing service to the EPA. But I think there should be some, we are also supposed to be an independent advisory committee. And that means, trying to address what the appropriate questions are, as well as what answers we want to give to those questions. Thank you.
Yeah, no, appreciate that comment very much. And I'll say, as a person who was not on the work group, so I don't know exactly the conversation that transpired, but seeing the report that came out, it did expand beyond where I thought it might go. And especially on those broader EJ questions, I felt that that there was additional scope that the work group shaped and kind of framed. Now, I can be wrong. I wasn't part of those meetings. So I'm just saying, as the person who sees what's coming out the other end. But I understand that not everything changed about it. And maybe there were things that you wanted to include that you don't feel like were. And so, of course, that's an understandable reaction then in that case. Dr. Olmsted, did you just turn your, are there thoughts from others?
Yeah, I would just chime in
Dr.
on one thing. When we had that conversation at the work group with regard to charge questions and how that sometimes steers us down the wrong path. I mean, I was reflecting back on panels that I've led where we didn't really have a robust discussion of the charge questions. We considered them, but it wasn't with a lens towards, if we were writing the charge questions, how would we craft those and what would we think is the most important? And so I think it really is incumbent on all of us to maybe have a changed mindset and do more homework up front, more thinking about the charge questions and whether we feel overly confined or whether those are the correct charge questions, and then where appropriate, go beyond them in a way that's thoughtful from the outset.
Appreciate that comment very much. And that's a nice synopsis too of where the work group kind of ended up on this. I know the SAB staff office is also very attentive to this issue and wants to make sure there's space for scoping charge questions more broadly. On this particular item, because I think Richard is bringing us an interesting thought, is there, what is the sense of the board about moving ahead with maybe a different work group? I don't think we can necessarily say the same one because they did their work and we appreciate it and we did vote it through, but maybe with a different group trying to pursue some additional questions. Is that something that I should be talking to the staff office about and sort of looking at our workload and seeing if we can move ahead on that? Or are we more going to wait for other actions which continue to come to us and other opportunities to pull some of these threads into those reviews? Because that's another way to go about doing this is, knowing what you're interested in and keeping an eye for those. There's sort of two avenues. One is, this more self-assigned, and the other is when we see opportunities, we're ready and we're ready to jump in with some of that. Let's see, is that Amanda? Did you want to say something? No, people's screens keep popping up. Dr. Guggenheimer, go ahead. You're not Amanda, go ahead.
No, I'm not Amanda. I am in the same town.
Nice.
I'd like to reemphasize what I said this morning. On this particular issue, my fervent hope is that electrification of heavy-duty vehicles will make this issue totally moot. That the time frame for implementation of regulations is not that different from the time frame for which a substantial part of the fleet of vehicles in this country are projected to become electric. And if they do become electric, the issue goes away.
Thanks for that point. Dr. Unruh. I think you might be on mute. Florence.
Yeah, I'm
there you
on
go.
mute now. So
No
I
worries.
was trying to address the comment by Dr. Richard Smith in terms of the scope of the questions. And I think we probably need to go back to the role of the SAB, what we're supposed to be doing as members, and have we achieved those or our responsibilities. And also, I also believe that when each member provides comment on the charge questions, many of it tend to go beyond the scope of the questions, and also providing more comprehensive topics or inputs that would make those rulemakings more comprehensive, and especially in this case, the EJ questions. I know that yesterday and today, there were a lot of comments from the members and the public comment also that if incorporated into the final review, I think it would probably address some of the issues that he's talking about. And because I don't know if making the questions broader would make that better. It's that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, nice points there. And I mean, you're right in the final part of what you said. You can make the questions broader, or you can just act more broadly within the questions that you have. And we've seen both versions of that in the work that our work groups and panels have been doing, which I think is an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, I'm scanning the room for other, it looks like Drew, perhaps. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I still can't find that hand button.
No
I
worries.
used to know where it was, but anyway, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of those comments about, I think that the working group, I would say thank you. I think you did a great job on the heavy duty diesel. And I don't think that is the obvious correct place to figure out what climate change does to health. And, one of the reasons is, yes, maybe we'll solve the transport problem and that will go away for that particular issue, but, it's not going to go away for everything else that affects climate, right? This is something that spans all of our rules. And so that's what I was trying to get at by raising this is, if there is a fundamental gap in our science knowledge that's not necessarily a main contributor to what we're trying to do with heavy duty diesel vehicles or whatever the particular rule is there another pathway for the SAB to try to comment on, ways to improve the knowledge that would help all future rulemaking rather than any specific one? And it might not be, purely an EPA thing, but that's what I was kind of trying to get at earlier. Thank you.
No, very, very much appreciate that. I see Dr. Thorne and then Tom Brennan's up there. And,
Yeah,
as I said, we do sometimes assign ourselves work as well, but go ahead, Dr. Thorne.
Let me yield to Tom and then I'll jump in after that if
Okay.
it's still germane.
All right.
Thank you, Peter. I just wanted to just generally talk about how work comes to the SAB or how you can generate your own work, to answer Drew's question. So if you wanted to get at a particular issue, it might be that in the peer reviews that come before you in the next weeks and months ahead, or the regulatory review, you will get an opportunity to make comments on different areas, scopes of area of interest. But it is also possible, and we have a history of that the board has done self-initiated projects. So that's also an option. The way we've done that in the past is we've had a broad board-wide discussion where people might bring more than one idea and the board will discuss. And it can be a very effective tool. It can be a challenging tool as well. One of the challenges of doing it is it's much easier for a body like this to react to work from the agency sometimes than it is to initiate and do the work themselves. So that is one thing to consider, but I don't say that to scare you off. If there's something important that this group wants to do, we do have mechanisms to accomplish that, Drew.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah,
thanks, Tom.
To your question, Dr. Cullen, then should we consider forming a panel to take on the issues that Richard Smith has raised? And so the question I have is, what specifically would those issues be? Is it all around social cost of carbon? I think that's the second part of what I understand your letter was in, and I didn't see your letter. I'm shooting from the hip here. But could you define what the scope might be so that we are talking about something tangible?
Yeah, and can I just say one thing before that? So Peter, I thought you raised a great point. I think we would make a space potentially at a future meeting for other folks to bring their topics forward as well, because I think there may be, a healthy handful of topics out there, and I would want to see them all together. I think it's hard to do them one by one.
Yeah. Sometimes though, if we have those out ahead, we can identify that we need a briefing.
Absolutely.
And then schedule a briefing to have a more informed discussion.
Absolutely. And we did have a look at the social cost of carbon. Was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago? I'm looking at Tom Brennan. I was part of a panel. John Graham chaired it. Yeah, that was one of several topics. Dr. Alion, and then who do we have? Jacoby Wilson, which everyone else calls Sakabi. How do you say your name?
It is Jacoby, and it's
Jacoby.
background music.
Got it.
Like Shaq and Kobe. Not really can say it now because Kobe's no longer with us. But that's the easiest way to help people remember. Shaq and Kobe.
All right,
Yes.
Jacoby. But first, Dr. Alion, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really important discussion I think we're having. So I appreciate and it is complex. So I didn't want to speak to the point of, yes, if you really want to add something to additional work, that has to be a process that everybody agrees on. So, not nominations come in, but certainly ideas. But I did want to get back to the concept that EPA is asking certain charge questions be answered in some ways, I assume, because they want more information to help them address something that they're working on that will improve whatever it is that topic. But in addition, I think it'd be really helpful if the working groups could think outside just those charge questions as the reports are devised, to not just fill in a specific gap, because I agree that we often do that in the responses and say, this hasn't been considered in response to that charge question. But I think it'd be really great, a little bit as was done in this particular case with the appendix, but maybe in a different kind of format, but that it's done more systematically, what other things sort of are missing in these charge questions that might sort of develop a charge question developed by the committee itself, not the whole SAB, but I'm saying the smaller group that's being asked to do the report. Because I think what EPA, that would also help EPA, because I think sometimes there may be things that are just outside of what has been thought about or a particular individual is working on, and then that can lead to, you know, additional things down the road. So I think that those are two very separate approaches, and I agree with the Tom Brennan that sometimes creating that new work idea is a lot more difficult in some ways, and will be more logistically complex as well, than really having the group at the start of the report making for any particular charge questions to really think through like what's really missing, and what can we assist EPA to broaden its perspective on whatever the issue is.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, and I want to make it really clear. So that is in fact the approach that was being discussed, is that the work groups at the start of their work would think about the charge questions and what else they might like to add to the charge questions. But separately, if the SAB as a whole wants to assign itself work, then that would be a whole board conversation and would come from all the various things that folks felt like weren't really coming up through that normal flow of regulatory actions that we look at and the opportunities that we have that way. You know, just feeling that there's something more we should be doing. We're not really carrying out our mandate if we don't assign ourselves a particular topic. And so absolutely everything that you said. And I just wanted to make it clear. Sorry if I was confusing about that before. But the work group would definitely be the starting point on the format.
Absolutely. So those are two very separate approaches with separate missions.
Yes, thank you. And Jacoby.
Yeah, I can't really provide a lot of feedback. There's music in the background because I'm at the airport. So I'm not sure can y'all hear it?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, cool. So I appreciate what Dr. Elian said. I think great comments about the work group. I mean, I think this is one of my first experiences with the work group, so I would like to have that flexibility. I do like the work that came out of work around environmental justice, and I would say that for me, like having just being an environmental justice researcher, to have an environmental justice screen for a lot of these regulatory discussions, I think that would be a good practice. And maybe you want to have a climate equity screen as well. So we make sure we have these certain, like these big things that the EPA wants to work on, that we just make sure that those things are always kind of there, when they're relevant. So that's one to make that point. But I think having some more flexibility will be helpful. Because we have major time constraints too. So I had time constraints myself. So it's very difficult, as you said earlier, to do this work, but it's been overextended. But I do like the discussion. And on the social cost of carbon, it's an interesting one to talk about, because from an EJ perspective, it doesn't really do the job. So just want to call that out when you think about intergenerational cumulative impacts, right? So when we talk about that type of tool, it has assumptions and biases that may undermine, not just for this rule, but some of the work we're trying to do around climate justice. So I just want to put that out there as a point about let's not put all our eggs in that basket, because it has its own issues.
Thank you. Really appreciate that comment. Dr. Smith, you're up.
Yeah, just a very quick response to Jacoby. I mean, I did want to say that I did appreciate very much the work that you and your colleagues did on the environmental justice question. I thought the report made some excellent points about that. I did respond, if you read my letter in detail, to one of the points you raised, but I won't try to repeat that now. I think the EJ issue is important and the SAB should continue working on it.
Thanks. I think a lot of people share that view, so I really appreciate you reflecting that. Well, I think this is a fantastic conversation, and I think we've got a lot to think about moving forward. I will definitely talk a little bit more to the staff office just about sort of what's coming and trying to see, we get this barrage, well, not a barrage, but we get a steady flow of regulatory actions that we're looking at, but then trying to see within that, where do we have opportunities to weigh in on certain issues and where are things really not coming up? And I would welcome any of you who want to have side conversations or have ideas about things that are, please feel free to flag those for the staff office as well, so we can get those into the conversation. Richard, you've done that. You've flagged something that you think we need to be thinking about. So we'll put that into the conversation. But I think for now, as a board of 45 people, I don't think we can make like a decision on the spot right now about whether it makes sense to move forward on this element. It's important that you brought it forward. I am really glad you support the work group's product, because it was a fantastic effort, and it doesn't do every single thing. It can't. So yeah, but you've given us a lot to think about, and you spurred a great conversation right here. So I appreciate that. I don't know if anyone else, I'm going to in a second turn to Tom Armitage to wrap up our meeting, but I don't want to cut this short if someone else has like a burning comment they want to make.
Allison, I just want to mention that Britt Carmen, who wanted to offer public comments, is now in our meeting.
Oh, let's have public comment then. Yes, sure thing. We got ahead of our schedule by substantially. So I appreciate that you're here now, and we certainly feel free to open that back up for public comment. Britt, it's a 2-minute public comment period, and then we can have a question or two from the board. Thank you.
Oh, okay, I'm so sorry. I thought it was 3 minutes. I'll try to get through it very quickly.
We could have 3. We are ahead of schedule. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Britt Carmen. I'm a senior advocate at the Natural Resources Defense Council. And I'm here today on behalf of NRDC's more than 3 million members and activists who support our efforts to safeguard the rights of all people to clean air, clean water, and a healthy planet. Eliminating heavy-duty vehicle and engine pollution is essential to protecting human health, the communities, and our planet. And it's EPA's duty under the Clean Air Act to set the strongest possible standards. And EPA has a strong enough technical record to support the feasibility of this action, and also to really support the public health benefits that result from reducing heavy-duty truck emissions through electrification efforts and the acceleration of zero-emission vehicle technology. But today, I'd like to highlight an addition to this record, which is an analysis that was commissioned by colleagues of mine at NRDC, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Sierra Club to assess the impact of truck regulations on employment. Our report examines the pre-buy, low-buy myth by analyzing prior federal heavy-duty vehicle regulations to see whether and how they impact employment, production, and sales. This report examines this through a difference in difference test, which compares the results of the regulations impact on the heavy-duty vehicle sector by using the light-duty vehicle sector as a benchmark. Would have been unaffected by prior heavy-duty vehicle regulation. And this this approach looks to see if these new standards cause the heavy-duty sector to behave differently than the light-duty sector, and if the heavy-duty sector was not significantly different from the light-duty sector in terms of employment, production, and sales, then the heavy-duty vehicle regulations were not a causal factor. Specifically, the report studies the 2007 heavy-duty vehicle regulation, which required large technology changes to meet emission reduction requirements. And for good measure, we also look at the 2004, 2010, and 2014 regulations. In this study, if a pre-buy, low-buy occurred, the expectation is to see a positive significant difference in the pre-regulation period and a negative significant difference in the post-regulation period for employment, production, and sales. And while our report did observe some differences in employment, production, and sales, our analysis found that there was insufficient evidence to definitively attribute those impacts to the regulation, specifically because the heavy-duty vehicle is so complex and is largely affected by these larger macroeconomic factors at play. So in conclusion, the results from this analysis demonstrates that adopting option 1's more stringent requirements are unlikely to have a pre-buy, low-buy impact on heavy-duty vehicle employment, production, and sales, especially since there's no historical evidence of such an impact occurring during the previous standards. So in conclusion, given this, the fact that anything less than the strongest NOx engine standard fails to adequately address both the health crisis in communities burdened by freight traffic and the climate crisis that's being propelled by transportation emissions, we urge the SAB to recommend to Administrator Regan that he and the agency have a strong enough technical record to enact the most protective and stringent engine standards that are incredibly necessary, especially those that would align with state action underway, such as California's low NOx heavy-duty omnibus, and a standard that puts us solidly on of these heavy-duty vehicles being zero emissions. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for your comment. Board members, any questions for Britt Carmen? Britt, you're getting us at the end of a long meeting. Really appreciate you taking the time and coming and addressing us.
Yes,
And,
absolutely. And I know we've provided the report and like a cover letter summary as well. So hopefully you have all of that and we have our contact information on there should there be any questions.
We do. We have all of your materials and they've been circulated. So thank you. All right. I'm looking around the room. I don't see any questions. No, it looks like you've been heard, but no one has a question right now. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Good luck with the rest of your meeting.
Oh, thank you. All right. If there are no further questions from the board, I would ask the DFO, Tom Armitage, to adjourn the meeting. But if there is anything else, we're watching for hands.
I just had a procedural question going,
Yes.
sorry. Because at the beginning of the meeting yesterday, you had mentioned that we're going to move back to in-person meetings, right? And so I was just, maybe I missed this, but is there sort of a timeline for the next chartered SAB meeting?
Yeah, I'll answer that quickly and Tom Brennan will correct me if I'm wrong. I think for this body to be back in person, we'd probably be looking at a timeline of next summer. There may be intermediate, there would be other charter board meeting and panel meetings, including panel meetings that may happen in person. But for this whole body to meet in person, it would be, Tom, next summer, I think.
Yeah, I think what we'll be watching for as it relates to the board is a meeting that has enough content that's actually worthy of having the travel to support it. We might have a board meeting this winter that only has 1 or 2 items on it. It might be a 4-hour meeting, and that really might not justify coming together. But when it comes to panels, when they have to have big opening discussions on topics for peer reviews, and Allison and I will be looking out for board meetings that have the content to support getting together. And I'm confident in the months ahead that we'll find that opportunity. But I can't tell you exactly what date yet, Wei Shui.
It's not the next couple months, put it that way. How's that?
Yeah. I hope that helps. And then just to further clarify, because I did get a question offline, we'll be working with our contractor to develop a sort of a hybrid approach to the meetings. So that if someone misses a flight, flights are squirrely in America these days, or if someone's not feeling well, or if someone can't make it, that you would still, the participant that couldn't make the event in person would still have opportunities to contribute. So we'll put an eye to that, and it'll be the first time. Trust me, I'll be watching, and we'll make adjustments. But it's time to put our toe back in the water and jump in and get to see each other face to face. Because I think, although this has gone very well over Zoom, and I'm very pleased with all your efforts and your collective efforts, we do miss something when we're not face to face, and I'm looking forward to trying that again.
Yeah, I just asked because there's sort of been a pent up demand over 2.5 years of in person. So then lots of times people's schedules fill up very quickly. In the coming months. Yeah,
absolutely.
We'll try to give a good warning, and I'm definitely keeping my eye out for that first sort of signature meeting when we can all get together with the right content.
Thanks. And Shakobi said, this is my first flight in however many years. Anyway, all right. I think some other people are in that same boat. All right. Well, I really appreciate everyone's time, a tremendous amount of engagement, and very free flowing ideas, which is what we need in order to make progress on our margins. So thank you all. And huge thanks to the staff office as always. They really carry the ball with our communications with EPA and making those connections. And we got to see some of the fruits of their labor because EPA was very engaged with us yesterday and gave us a lot of their time and attention, which was so much appreciated. And we know that doesn't just happen. So thank you, Tom and Zaida and the whole crew. Really appreciate it. And turn it back over to Tom to adjourn the meeting.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all. I just want to add my thanks for all your work. And with that, I think we can adjourn the meeting today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.